12 pairs of desperate eyes watched from the shadowed ridge as the lone giant of a man moved through the morning mist below. They were starving. He was their last hope. But in 1887 Montana, a white rancher and Cherokee children weren't supposed to cross paths, much less become family. Yet on that frozen November dawn, when the smallest child would whisper those 4 words that changed everything. "We're starving, sir." A lonely man's answer would defy a nation's cruelty and rewrite what family could mean on the American frontier. This is the story of how 12 children facing death found a father facing emptiness, and together they built something the West had never seen. Stay with me until the end, and comment below what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story of courage and love can travel across the world. The wind that November morning carried the kind of cold that cut straight through to the bone, the kind that made even the hardiest Montana ranchers think twice before stepping outside. But Elias Granger wasn't the kind of man who thought twice about much anymore. At 6 feet 7 inches tall, with shoulders broad enough to carry a full-grown calf and hands that could gentle a spooked horse or split an oak log with equal ease, Elias had stopped thinking about comfort the day they lowered Sarah into the ground. That had been 3 years ago come spring. 3 years of waking to silence. 3 years of cooking meals for one when the kitchen table had 8 empty chairs. 3 years of walking past the small bedroom upstairs, the one they'd painted yellow together, the one with the cradle he'd carved from cherry wood, and feeling his chest tighten with a grief so profound it sometimes took his breath away entirely. The ranch had been their dream. 1,500 acres of Montana grassland stretching toward mountains that scraped the sky, with water from the Clearwater River running crystal and cold through the western pasture. They'd bought it with money saved from 7 years of Elias working timber camps, Sarah taking in sewing, both of them dreaming of the day they'd have children running through fields of wildflowers, learning to ride, growing strong and free under the endless western sky. But Sarah's body hadn't been strong enough for childbirth. The baby, a son they'd planned to name Thomas, after Elias's father, had lived only 3 hours. Sarah had followed him 2 days later, her hand going cold in Elias's, even as he begged her to hold on, promised her anything, everything, if she'd just stay. She hadn't stayed, and Elias Granger, once known throughout the territory as a man whose laughter could fill a barn and whose kindness extended to every neighbor within a day's ride, had retreated into a solitude so complete that some folks in the nearby town of Shepherd's Bend had begun to wonder if he'd gone strange in the head. He hadn't gone strange. He'd gone numb. There was a difference. The ranch prospered despite his grief, or perhaps because of it. Elias poured every waking hour into the land and livestock. His cattle were the fattest in 3 counties. His horses were known for their gentle temperament and strong legs. His fields produced hay that other ranchers would ride 20 miles to purchase. The work was constant, demanding, exhausting. That was precisely what Elias needed. Exhaustion meant sleep. Sleep meant fewer hours lying awake remembering the sound of Sarah's laugh, the way she'd hum while kneading bread, how she'd looked at him with absolute certainty the day they'd wed, and said, "We're going to build something beautiful, Elias Granger, you and me together." But he was alone now, and the only thing he'd built was a profitable ranch that felt more like a prison than a home. On this particular November morning, Elias rose before dawn, as always, dressed in the same routine: wool pants, flannel shirt, leather vest, the heavy coat Sarah had sewn for him that last winter, and headed out to the barn through air so cold his breath hung in clouds before his face. The sky was that peculiar shade of gray that suggested snow was coming, probably before nightfall. He'd need to bring the yearling cattle down from the north pasture, check that the hay was properly stored, maybe reinforce the shelter he'd built for the chickens. Always another task. Always another reason not to sit still and think. He was halfway to the barn when he felt it, that prickle at the back of his neck that told him he wasn't alone. Elias had spent enough time hunting, enough years learning to read the wilderness, to trust his instincts. He slowed his pace, but didn't stop, didn't turn around. His eyes scanned the ridge to the east, where pine trees stood like dark sentinels against the lightning sky. There. Movement among the rocks, barely visible, but definitely there. Animals would have scattered at his approach. This was something else. Someone else. Elias continued to the barn as if he'd noticed nothing. Inside, his 3 horses, Goliath, Bessie, and the young mare he'd simply been calling Red, nickered their morning greeting. He took his time with their feed, his movements deliberate and calm, but his mind was working rapidly. Drifters sometimes passed through, looking for work or a handout. Elias had always helped when he could, remembering the years when he'd had nothing himself. But drifters didn't usually hide on ridges at dawn. They came to the door, hat in hand, respectful and direct, which meant whoever was up there didn't want to be seen. And if they didn't want to be seen, they probably had a reason. His hand moved instinctively to the rifle he kept mounted inside the barn door, but he stopped himself. If they'd meant him harm, they could have acted during the night when he was sleeping. More likely they were desperate, maybe dangerous in that cornered animal way that desperation could make a person. Either way, getting a weapon involved seemed like a way to escalate things that didn't need escalating. Instead, Elias did something that would have made his old logging camp friends laugh at him for being a sentimental fool. He milked Bessie, taking more milk than he needed for himself, and then deliberately, obviously, carried a full pail out to the old pine stump about 50 yards from his porch. The stump had served as an impromptu table many times over the years. He set the milk there, along with half a loaf of yesterday's bread wrapped in cloth, and walked back to the house without looking toward the ridge. If they were desperate enough to be watching his place, they were probably desperate enough to be hungry. And Elias Granger, for all his isolation and grief, had never been a man who could ignore hunger when he had plenty. The rest of that day passed in the usual rhythm of ranch work. Elias mended fence line in the south pasture, checked the cattle, hauled water, chopped wood. The physical labor felt good, as always. Muscles working, breath steaming, the satisfaction of tangible tasks completed. But throughout the day, part of his attention remained on that ridge. He didn't see anyone. But when he went to bring his horses in at dusk, the milk and bread were gone from the stump. Something in Elias's chest, something that had been locked tight for 3 years, cracked just slightly open. That night, he left more food. Biscuits this time, with butter and the last of Sarah's preserved jam from the cellar, plus a jug of water and a thick wool blanket that had been sitting unused in the chest at the foot of his bed. The next morning, it was all gone except the jug, which had been neatly returned to the stump, and the blanket, which was folded more carefully than any drifter he'd ever known would have bothered with. Definitely not a drifter. Elias stood on his porch that second morning, coffee mug warming his hands, and made a decision. "I don't know who you are up there," he called toward the ridge, his deep voice carrying easily in the still morning air, "but I'm leaving food and water on that stump every night. If you need help, come down and ask. If you need to stay hidden, that's your business. But nobody goes hungry on my land if I can help it." He didn't expect an answer and didn't get one. But that evening, when he set out a pot of stew that was far too much for one man, along with more bread and a canteen of coffee, he thought he caught the briefest glimpse of something small darting between the rocks. Not one person. Several. And unless his eyes were playing tricks in the fading light, at least one of them was child-sized. The crack in Elias's chest widened a little more. Children. Out there in the cold. Hiding like animals. He knew enough about what was happening in the territories to guess at the likely truth. The newspapers that made their way to Shepherd's Bend had been full of stories about the government's new policies toward the tribes. Relocation, boarding schools, families torn apart in the name of civilization and education. Elias had read those articles with growing disgust, remembering the Shoshone and Blackfeet families he'd known during his timber camp days, good people, hard workers, who'd shown him more kindness and honor than most white men he'd encountered. If these were tribal children hiding on his land, they were probably running from something, or someone. And if they were running, they were probably more terrified than he could imagine. For the first time in 3 years, Elias went to bed that night thinking about someone other than himself and his own grief. Somewhere up on that ridge, children were sleeping in the cold. Children who were hungry enough to risk stealing from a stranger. Children who had no one to protect them except themselves. The thought kept him awake long into the night. On the third morning, Elias woke to find tracks in the light dusting of snow that had fallen during the night. Small footprints. Some barefoot, which made his jaw clench with anger at whoever had let children go without proper shoes this late in the season. leading from the ridge down to his stump and back again. But this time, the tracks had come closer to his house, to his barn specifically. Someone had been checking out his horses, or maybe looking for shelter warmer than whatever they'd found on that wind-blasted ridge. Elias made his decision. He spent the morning preparing. He cooked everything he could think of that would appeal to hungry children: flapjacks with syrup, scrambled eggs, bacon, fried potatoes, more biscuits, even a hastily made apple cobbler using the last of his stored fruit. He set it all out on his kitchen table, which was large enough to seat 10 people comfortably. Then he opened both his front door and barn door wide, despite the cold, and went back to his normal morning work. The message was clear. You're welcome here. Come inside where it's warm. But the morning passed, then the afternoon, and no one came. The food sat untouched on his table. Elias forced himself not to look toward the ridge, not to show any sign of watching or waiting. He cleaned tack in the barn, repaired a saddle that had been needing attention for weeks, and tried not to feel like a fool for hoping. Dusk was falling when he finally heard it, the softest scuff of a foot on his porch boards. Then silence. Long, tense silence. Elias kept working on the saddle, his back to the barn door, giving whoever was there time to decide. His heart was pounding harder than it had in years, not from fear, from something he'd almost forgotten how to feel. Hope. Sir? The voice was so quiet he almost missed it. Young, male, trying hard to sound brave. Sir, are you the man who's been leaving food? Elias set down the leather he'd been working and turned slowly, careful not to make any sudden movements. Standing in the barn doorway, silhouetted against the fading light, was a boy of perhaps 13 or 14. He was painfully thin, his clothes little more than rags, his dark hair hanging past his shoulders. But his spine was straight and his chin was up, and his eyes, dark eyes that had seen far too much for someone so young, met Elias's without flinching. I am, Elias said simply. He stayed seated on his work stool, making himself smaller, less threatening. My name's Elias Granger. This is my ranch. The boy nodded slowly. His hand, Elias noticed, never strayed far from something tucked into his waistband, probably a knife. Smart kid. My name is Caleb, the boy said. Then, after a pause, Caleb Redfeather. Cherokee, then. Elias had learned enough about the tribes to recognize some of the naming patterns. Pleased to meet you, Caleb. Elias kept his voice gentle, the same tone he'd use with a skittish horse. That food in the house is for you and anyone else who needs it. There's no trick, no catch. You're welcome to it. Caleb's jaw tightened. We're not beggars. Never said you were. Elias held the boy's gaze. But there's enough food there for more than just you, and winter's coming. Whatever your situation is, you don't have to tell me. But you don't have to freeze or starve either. Not when I've got a warm barn and more food than I can eat myself. For a long moment, Caleb said nothing. Elias could practically see him thinking, weighing, trying to decide if this strange giant of a white man could be trusted. Finally, Caleb said, There are 12 of us. Elias felt his breath catch. 12. 12 children out there in the cold. 12's a good number, he managed to say, his voice rougher than he'd intended. I've got room. The youngest is 5. The oldest is me. I'm 14. We've been on our own for... Caleb's voice cracked slightly, the first sign of the boy beneath the brave mask. For almost 2 months, since they came for our parents. They. The word carried a weight of pain and rage that Elias understood instinctively. The government men. The soldiers. The people who'd decided that tribal families weren't good enough, that children needed to be saved from their own heritage and culture. Are they coming after you? Elias asked quietly. Caleb's hand moved closer to his hidden knife. Would you give us up if they were? It was a test. Elias recognized it as such, respected it even. No, he said, and meant it with every fiber of his being. I wouldn't. Another long pause. Then Caleb turned his head slightly and made a soft sound, barely more than a whistle. Slowly, from the shadows around the barn, from behind the water trough, From inside the empty horse stall, children began to appear. They came one by one, stepping into the light with the wariness of deer entering a clearing. A girl of about 12 with braids and fierce eyes. Two smaller boys who might have been twins, holding hands. A girl barely 6 years old clutching a doll made from corn husks. More and more, until Elias counted 11 standing before him, with Caleb making 12. 11 children, all Cherokee, all painfully thin, all dressed in inadequate clothing for Montana winter, all looking at him with a mixture of hope and terror that broke something fundamental in his chest. The smallest one, a little girl with enormous dark eyes and hair that fell in tangled curls to her waist, stepped forward. She couldn't have been more than 5 years old. She looked up at Elias, who must have seemed like an absolute giant to someone her size, and whispered 4 words that would change his life forever. "We're starving, sir." Elias Granger, who hadn't cried since the day they'd buried Sarah and baby Thomas, felt his eyes burning. He cleared his throat roughly and stood up slowly so as not to startle anyone. "Well," he said, his voice gruff with emotion he wasn't quite ready to name, "we'd better get you all fed then. Come on, all of you. Into the house where it's warm." For a moment, no one moved. Then the little girl reached up and took Elias's hand with complete trust, and something inside him that had been frozen for 3 years began, finally, to thaw. The children followed him to the house in near silence, their eyes wide as they took in the ranch buildings, the sturdy fences, the chickens settling into their coop for the night. When they reached the porch, several of them hesitated, clearly uncomfortable about entering a white man's home. Caleb said something in Cherokee, his voice firm, and they followed him inside. The spread Elias had laid out that morning was still there, somewhat cooled but no less abundant. He quickly stoked the fire in the kitchen stove and began reheating everything while the children stood clustered together near the door, not quite believing this was real. "Sit," Elias said, gesturing to the table and the mismatched chairs around it. "Please, you're safe here." It was Caleb who moved first, choosing a chair with his back to the wall where he could see both doors. The others followed his lead, arranging themselves around the table with the practiced efficiency of a group that had learned to function as a unit. The little girl who'd spoken earlier climbed into a chair that was far too big for her, her feet dangling well above the floor. Elias began setting out plates, real china plates that hadn't been used since Sarah died, and utensils. Several of the younger children looked at the forks uncertainly, and he realized they might not be used to eating with white utensils. "Use your hands if that's more comfortable," he said quietly. "There's no wrong way to eat in this house." The tension in the room eased slightly. When everything was laid out, Elias took his seat at the head of the table, the first time he'd sat there for a meal in 3 years, and said simply, "Eat." For a few seconds, no one moved. Then hunger overcame caution, and hands reached for food. The speed and desperation with which they ate confirmed what Elias had suspected. These children were far past mere hunger. They were genuinely starving. "Slow down," he said gently, worried someone would make themselves sick. "There's plenty. If you run out, I'll make more. No one's taking this food away." It took several minutes, but gradually the frantic pace slowed. The children began to look around at each other, at him, at the warm kitchen with its sturdy walls and glowing fire. One of the smaller boys started crying silently, tears running down his face even as he continued eating. The girl with the braids, Elias thought she might be the second oldest, put her arm around him. When the initial desperate hunger had been somewhat satisfied, Elias spoke again. "I'm Elias," he said. "Elias Granger. I already met Caleb. Would the rest of you be willing to tell me your names?" Another test. Names were important in most tribal cultures. He knew that much. Giving your name to someone was an act of trust. The girl with braids spoke first. "I'm Alina. That's my brother, Marcus." She indicated the crying boy under her arm. "We're from the Black Hills originally." The others followed, one by one, some speaking clearly, others barely whispering. Thomas and Joshua, the twins who were about 8. Maria, who was 10. Little Tessa, who'd been the one to say they were starving. Samuel, Benjamin, and David, 3 brothers ranging from 7 to 11. Ruth and Naomi, sisters who were 9 and 12. And finally, a girl of about 13 who'd been silent throughout the meal, her eyes never leaving Elias's face. "I'm Kai," she said finally, her voice stronger than he'd expected. "I'm Caleb's sister." My real name is Kai Riverwind, but the soldiers tried to make us forget our names, tried to make us into something we're not. Her chin lifted defiantly. We ran before they could. Elias nodded slowly, understanding more than was being said. These children had escaped from one of the government boarding schools, or were being transported to one. Either way, they were runaways in the eyes of the law, and he was now harboring them. He should have been worried about the legal implications. He should have been thinking about the complications this could bring to his life, but all he could think about was Sarah's voice in his memory. We're going to build something beautiful, Elias Granger. Maybe this was it. Maybe this was the beautiful thing they'd been meant to build. How long have you been on your own? He asked. Caleb answered. 7 weeks. We were being taken to a school in South Dakota. There were guards, but they got careless one night. We took food, blankets, what we could carry, and ran. We've been moving since then, hiding during the day, traveling at night. We knew winter was coming. We knew we needed to find shelter. When we saw your ranch, he trailed off, shrugging. You saw a lone man with more resources than he needed, Elias finished. And you took a chance. We were dying, Kai said bluntly. Another week in the cold, and we would have lost the little ones. Maybe longer than that. So yes, we took a chance on you. Even though you're... She stopped herself. White, Elias supplied without offense. Yes, I am, and I know you have no reason to trust me based on that alone, but I'm asking you to anyway. At least for tonight. You're all exhausted. You need sleep in a warm place. Tomorrow we can figure out what comes next. Well, they'll come looking for us eventually, Caleb said. The government doesn't like it when Indian children escape. They'll search. And if they find us here, you'll be in trouble too. Elias smiled, a real smile, the first one that had touched his face in longer than he could remember. Son, I'm 6'7". I've got more muscles than sense, according to most folks. And I'm meaner than a wounded bear when someone threatens something I care about. Let them come looking. By the time they get here, we'll have a plan. Why? The question came from little Tessa, who'd finished eating and was now studying Elias with those enormous, too knowing eyes. Why would you help us? You don't even know us. Elias looked at her, at all of them, at these 12 souls who'd somehow found their way to his door when he'd thought his life was finished with finding purpose. Because, he said slowly, choosing his words carefully, about 3 years ago, I lost my wife and my baby son. This house has been empty ever since. Not physically empty, I was here, but empty in the way that matters. And maybe you 12 needed a place to hide, and I needed something to care about besides my own grief. Maybe that's how the world works sometimes. The broken pieces find each other and figure out how to fit together. Silence filled the kitchen. Then Ruth, one of the middle children, said softly, Our mother used to say that the Creator puts people in each other's paths for a reason, even when it doesn't make sense at first. Your mother sounds like she was a wise woman, Elias said. She was. Ruth's voice broke slightly. They took her first, then our father when he tried to stop them. We don't know where they are now. Similar stories followed, each child sharing fragments of how they'd come to be in Caleb's group. Parents dead or taken. Families destroyed by violence or disease or government policy. Siblings separated. Children running for their lives from people who claimed to want to help them. By the time the stories wound down, full dark had fallen outside, and Elias had made a decision that would have seemed insane to his grief-stricken self of just 3 days ago. Here's what we're going to do, he said, his voice firm with purpose. Tonight, you're all sleeping in the barn loft. It's warm up there. I've got good hay and I'll bring extra blankets. Tomorrow we'll figure out more permanent sleeping arrangements. The house has 4 bedrooms upstairs that haven't been used in years. We'll need to clean them up, but they're sound. You're letting us stay? Maria asked, disbelief clear in her voice. If you're willing to work, Elias said. This is a ranch. There's always work to be done. I'm not running a charity, but I'm offering you a place, food, shelter, safety, in exchange for help with the chores and the land. If that seems fair to you, then yes, you can stay. 12 pairs of eyes stared at him. Caleb stood up slowly, came around the table and offered his hand in the way white men shook on agreements. His grip was firm despite his thinness. "We'll work harder than you've ever seen," Caleb promised. "We won't let you regret this." Elias shook his hand. "I don't think I'll regret it for a second." That night, Elias helped the children settle into the barn loft, bringing up every spare blanket he owned, lighting a lantern so they wouldn't be in complete darkness, making sure they knew where the privy was and that they could come to the house if they needed anything. The older children arranged the younger ones with practiced care, creating warm sleeping nests in the hay. Before he left them, little Tessa called down to him from where she was nestled between Ruth and Naomi. "Mr. Elias, will you really keep us safe?" He looked up at her small face, just barely visible in the lantern light, and felt that crack in his chest widen into something that might someday be whole again. "I'll keep you safe," he promised, "or die trying." He meant every word. That night, for the first time in 3 years, Elias Granger didn't go to bed thinking about death and loss. He went to bed thinking about life, about possibilities, about 12 children who needed him, and how maybe, just maybe, he needed them just as much. Outside, the Montana wind howled around the ranch buildings. But inside the barn loft, 12 children slept warm and full and safe, perhaps for the first time in longer than they could remember. And in the house, a lonely giant of a man lay awake, making plans, feeling his frozen heart beginning, finally, to beat again with something that felt remarkably like purpose. Tomorrow would bring challenges. He knew that. There would be questions to answer, lies to construct, stories to coordinate. If word got out that he was harboring escaped tribal children, there would be consequences. But tonight, that didn't matter. Tonight, 12 children were safe. Tonight, his empty house felt a little less empty. Tonight, the silence that had been crushing him for 3 years was broken by the knowledge that just beyond his walls, life was stirring again. Elias closed his eyes and, for the first time since Sarah died, allowed himself to believe that maybe his story wasn't over after all. Maybe it was just beginning again, in a way he never could have imagined. In the barn loft, Caleb lay awake long after the others had fallen asleep, his mind working through possibilities and dangers. This white man seemed genuine, kind even. But Caleb had learned the hard way that appearances could deceive, that promises could be broken, that trust was a luxury that could get you killed. Still, watching how Elias had looked at little Tessa, how he'd spoken to them all with respect rather than the contempt Caleb had come to expect from white adults, something in him wanted to believe, wanted to trust, wanted to let down his guard for just a moment and be the 14-year-old boy he was supposed to be, instead of the protector he'd been forced to become. Tomorrow, he'd be vigilant. Tomorrow, he'd watch for signs of betrayal. Tomorrow, he'd be ready to run if necessary. But tonight, just for tonight, Caleb let himself relax. Let himself believe they might have finally found what they'd been desperately searching for. A home. Dawn broke cold and clear over the Granger Ranch, painting the Montana sky in shades of pink and gold that seemed almost too beautiful for the complicated reality unfolding below. Elias was already awake, had been for an hour, standing at his kitchen window with a cup of coffee growing cold in his hands as he watched the barn and wondered if the children were still there or if they'd vanished in the night like ghosts he'd imagined in his loneliness. The barn door opened and Caleb emerged, followed by his sister Kai. They stood in the yard for a moment, speaking in low voices, their breath forming clouds in the frigid air. Then Caleb started toward the house with purposeful strides, while Kai returned to the barn. Elias opened the door before Caleb could knock. "Morning," he said simply. "Coffee?" Caleb nodded, stepping inside with the wariness still evident in every line of his thin frame. "The others are still sleeping. I wanted to talk to you alone first." "Smart." Elias poured a second cup and gestured to the table. "Sit. Tell me what's on your mind." Caleb wrapped his hands around the warm mug but didn't drink immediately. "You said yesterday that we could stay if we worked. I need to know exactly what that means. What are you expecting from us? What happens if someone comes looking? What's the plan if I betray you?" Elias interrupted gently. Caleb's jaw tightened. "You're white. You have everything to lose by helping us and nothing to gain. In my experience, people don't do things without a reason that benefits them. so I need to understand what you really want. It was a fair question, asked by someone who'd learned brutal lessons about trust. Elias respected him for asking it directly. What I want, Elias said slowly, is to not be alone anymore. What I want is for this house to mean something again besides a place where I sleep and eat. What I want is to do something right, because I've spent 3 years doing nothing but surviving, and surviving isn't the same as living. He paused, meeting Caleb's eyes. But more than what I want, here's what I'm offering. A home, real shelter, not temporary. Education if you want it. I can read and write, and I can teach. Protection to the best of my ability. And time. Time for all of you to figure out what you want to do next without starving or freezing while you're thinking. And in exchange, help with the ranch, honest work. And if anyone comes asking questions, we'll need a story that holds together. You'll need new names, probably. A history that makes sense. We'll have to be careful, and we'll have to be smart. Caleb studied him for a long moment. You're risking a lot. They could arrest you for harboring us. Fine you. Maybe worse. Let them try. Elias smiled grimly. I'm not afraid of government men in fancy suits who think they have the right to destroy families. I saw enough injustice in the timber camps to last a lifetime. This isn't complicated for me, Caleb. You're children who need help. I can help. That's all the reason I need. Something in Caleb's expression shifted, softened just slightly. He took a sip of his coffee and made a face at the bitter taste. Elias almost laughed. The boy was still young enough to dislike coffee for all his forced maturity. There's sugar in that cabinet if you need it, Elias said. And I should warn you, I make terrible coffee. Sarah used to say I could strip paint with it. Sarah was your wife? Was. The word still hurt, but less than it had yesterday somehow. She died 3 years ago, her and our baby both. This was supposed to be their home too. Caleb absorbed this information quietly. I'm sorry. I know what it's like to lose family. I suspect you do. Elias stood and began pulling ingredients from his shelves. Now I'm going to milk enough breakfast to feed an army, and you're going to help me carry it to the barn so we can eat together. After that, we'll start figuring out the practical things. Agreed? Agreed. They worked in companionable silence, Elias cooking while Caleb watched and learned. Eggs, bacon, biscuits, gravy, fried potatoes, oatmeal with cinnamon and brown sugar. Enough food for 12 growing children and one oversized rancher. When they carried the platters across the yard, the other children were awake and waiting, their faces lighting up at the sight of so much food. They ate in the barn loft, sitting in a circle on the hay, and for the first time Elias saw some of them smile. Little Tessa claimed a spot right next to him, her small hand occasionally reaching out to pat his arm as if to confirm he was real. You're very tall, she announced between bites of biscuit. Like a mountain. I've been called worse, Elias replied, earning a giggle from her and several of the other younger children. After breakfast, Elias gathered them all together and laid out his thinking. We need to be smart about this. If anyone from town comes by, and eventually someone will because people get curious, we need a story that makes sense. The truth is too dangerous for all of us. What kind of story? Ruth asked. One where you're my late wife's relatives, distant cousins maybe from back east. Your parents died. Disease, accident, something that can't be easily checked. And I took you in because family is family. It's close enough to the truth that you won't trip over the lies, but different enough that it won't connect you to any missing Cherokee children from a government school. Kai frowned. You want us to pretend we're white? No. Elias was firm on this. I want you to be safe. Your skin is your skin. Your heritage is your heritage. And I'm not asking you to deny any of that, but I am asking you to let people think you're under my legal protection as family. It's the only way this works without the government showing up to take you away. The older children exchanged glances, clearly torn. Alina spoke up. It feels like erasing who we are. I understand that, Elias said quietly, and I can't pretend to know what it's like to have people try to strip away your identity. But I do know that dead children don't have any identity at all. This isn't about shame. It's about survival. We can honor who you are in this house, in private, in all the ways that matter. But in public, We play the game that keeps you alive. Caleb nodded slowly. He's right. We've already been running and hiding for weeks. This is just a different kind of hiding, smarter hiding. We'll need new last names, Kai said. All of us should have the same one if we're supposed to be family. Granger, Elias said, if you're willing, you'd be the Granger children. I'd be your legal guardian. When enough time has passed that it's safe, we can look into making it official with adoption papers. The word adoption hung in the air like something fragile and precious. Several of the younger children looked at each other with cautious hope. You'd really do that? Thomas, one of the 8-year-old twins, asked. You'd really make us your actual children? If you wanted that, yes, but that's a conversation for later when we're all sure this is going to work. For now, we're just figuring out how to survive the winter together. They spent the rest of the morning making plans and practicing their new story. The children would be distant relatives from Pennsylvania, orphaned when their parents' wagon had overturned crossing a river. They'd been brought west by a family friend who died of fever in Wyoming, and Elias had been contacted as the last living relation. It was plausible enough, tragic enough, and vague enough that casual questioning wouldn't poke holes in it. They practiced names: Caleb Granger, Kai Granger, Alina and Marcus Granger. The names felt strange on their tongues, but the children understood the necessity. In private, they could be Redfeather and Riverwind and all the other names that connected them to their heritage. In public, they were Grangers. After the storytelling practice, Elias began assigning chores. He was careful to match tasks to abilities. The older children got more demanding work, the younger ones simpler jobs that would still make them feel useful. Caleb and Joshua would help with the cattle. Kai and Alina would work on cleaning the unused bedrooms upstairs in the house. The middle children would tend the chickens and collect eggs. The youngest would help with simple tasks like gathering kindling and sorting vegetables from the root cellar. Everyone earns their keep, Elias explained. Not because I need free labor, but because sitting around feeling useless will make you all miserable. Trust me on that. I spent 3 years learning it the hard way. The children scattered to their assigned tasks with an eagerness that surprised him. They wanted to work, he realized, wanted to feel productive and valued. How long had it been since anyone had treated them like they had something worthwhile to contribute? Elias worked alongside Caleb and Joshua in the North Pasture, teaching them how to check cattle for illness, how to read the signs of a healthy herd, how to move livestock without spooking them. Caleb learned quickly, his hands sure and his questions intelligent. Joshua was quieter but equally capable once he understood what was expected. Your father taught you cattle work? Elias asked Caleb during a water break. My father taught me horses, Caleb replied, his voice carefully neutral. We had a small herd. He was training me to break and sell them. That was before, He didn't finish the sentence. Before the soldiers came. Before the soldiers came, Caleb confirmed. They said our land was needed for white settlers, said we were squatting on property that belonged to the government. My father had papers, legal documents proving we'd bought the land fair and square. They tore them up in front of us. Elias felt rage kindle in his chest, hot and righteous. I'm sorry that happened to you. It was wrong. Caleb looked at him with something like surprise. Most white people say the Indians should just accept civilization and stop causing trouble. Most white people are idiots who've never bothered to see past their own assumptions. Elias took a long drink from his canteen. The way I figure it, if someone showed up at my ranch and told me to leave because they'd decided they wanted it, I'd fight until they killed me. Your father did what any man would do protecting his family. There's no shame in that. Something in Caleb's posture relaxed slightly. Thank you for saying that. They worked in silence for a while, the physical labor creating a companionship that didn't need words. When they headed back toward the barn for the midday meal, Caleb said quietly, I think I'm starting to understand why the universe brought us to your door. Why's that? Because you're the kind of person who sees us as people first, not Indians first, not problems first, just people who need help. Elias considered this. That's because you are people first. Everything else is just details. Back at the house, they found that Kai and Alina had worked miracles with the upstairs bedrooms. Dust covers had been removed, windows open to air things out, floors swept. The rooms weren't perfect yet, but they were livable. We found trunks full of women's clothing in one room, Kai said carefully. We didn't want to touch them without asking. Sarah's things. Elias had locked those away and tried to forget they existed. Those were my wife's, he said. You're welcome to anything that fits or that you can alter to fit. She'd want her things to be used by people who needed them. It was true, he realized. Sarah would have loved these children instantly, would have thrown herself into caring for them with all the fierce maternal energy she'd never gotten to use on their own child. Sharing her clothing with them felt right in a way that surprised him. The girls disappeared back upstairs, and Elias could hear excited whispers as they explored the trunks. For the first time in years, he felt something like Sarah's presence in the house. Not a ghost, but an echo of the generous spirit she'd embodied. Lunch was a lively affair with all 13 of them crowded around the kitchen table. The children were starting to relax, starting to believe this might be real. They asked questions about the ranch, about the animals, about Montana. They told stories about their lives before, carefully editing out the worst parts but sharing glimpses of who they'd been when the world was still safe. Elias found himself laughing at Tessa's animated description of the time she'd tried to help her mother make bread and had somehow ended up covered head to toe in flour. Found himself genuinely interested in Benjamin's detailed knowledge of local plants and their uses. Found himself impressed by Naomi's quick mathematical mind when she helped him calculate feed ratios for the horses. These weren't broken children, he realized. They were resilient, intelligent, capable children who'd been through hell and were still finding reasons to smile. After lunch, Elias took the oldest four, Caleb, Kai, Alina, and Naomi, aside for a more serious conversation. We need to talk about the legal reality, he said. If anyone comes looking for escaped boarding school children, they'll be searching for a group. 12 Cherokee kids traveling together is distinctive, but a white rancher with a large family of mixed heritage relatives? That's different enough that it might not register. You think they're searching? Kai asked. I think they will be eventually. The government doesn't like losing track of children it's decided to civilize. We need to be ready. Naomi, who'd been quiet, spoke up. What happens if they find us anyway? If they figure out who we really are? Elias met her eyes steadily. Then I'll fight them with every legal option available. I'll get lawyers if I have to. I'll contact newspapers if that's what it takes. I'll make enough noise that taking you away becomes more trouble than it's worth. You can't fight the government, Caleb said, but he sounded like he wanted to be convinced otherwise. Watch me. Elias's voice was hard with determination. I've got money. I've got a successful ranch that makes me respectable in the community. I've got size that intimidates people even when I don't want it to. And I've got a fundamental stubbornness that Sarah used to say could move mountains when I got my mind set on something. I'm not letting you go without the fight of my life. Kai blinked rapidly, and Elias realized with surprise that she was fighting tears. Why? She whispered. We're nothing to you. We're not your blood, not your responsibility. Why would you risk everything? Elias thought about Sarah, about the baby they'd lost, about 3 years of emptiness and grief, about how he'd been surviving but not living, existing but not thriving, about how in just 2 days these 12 children had reminded him what it felt like to have purpose. Because, he said slowly, family isn't just about blood. It's about choosing to show up for each other. It's about building something together that's stronger than what any of you could build alone. And maybe I'm not your blood father, and maybe you're not the children Sarah and I plan to raise, but we've found each other anyway, and that means something. That means everything. Alina wiped her eyes. If we stay, if this really works, we'll never stop being grateful. I don't want gratitude, Elias said firmly. I want partnership. I want you to work hard, be honest with me, and help me figure out how to make this crazy situation into something good. That's all. No debt, no obligation beyond what we owe each other as people sharing a home. They spent the afternoon continuing to settle in. The boys discovered the swimming hole in the creek, currently too cold for swimming but perfect for skipping stones. The girls finished organizing the bedrooms and began the process of moving their meager possessions upstairs. By dinner time, the house felt more alive than it had in years. That evening, as Elias cooked a massive pot of stew, little Tessa appeared at his elbow. "Mr. Elias?" she said. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course, sweetheart." Are you going to be our papa now? The question hit him square in the chest. He looked down at this tiny girl with her enormous eyes and her too thin face, and he understood that she wasn't just asking about legal arrangements. She was asking if he was going to love them. He knelt down so he was closer to her height. I'd like to be, if you'll have me. It might take time for it to feel real for all of us. But yes, Tessa, if you want a papa, I'll do my best to be that for you. She threw her arms around his neck with such force she nearly knocked him over. I want that very much, she whispered against his shoulder. Elias held her carefully, this fragile piece of trust that had been placed in his oversized hands, and felt something shift permanently in his heart. That night, after dinner and evening chores, they all gathered in the living room, a space that had been unused for years but now housed 13 people crowded onto furniture and floor cushions. Elias pulled out the guitar he hadn't touched since Sarah died and strummed a few tentative chords. Anyone know any songs? He asked. The children exchanged glances. Then Caleb began singing something in Cherokee, his voice clear and strong. One by one, the others joined in, their voices blending and harmonious that spoke of a cultural tradition Elias knew nothing about, but could recognize as beautiful and important. When the song ended, Elias said, "That was wonderful. Would you teach me?" They looked stunned. "You want to learn our songs?" Marcus asked. "I want to learn everything about where you come from," Elias said honestly. "Your language, your songs, your stories. If you're going to be part of my family, then your heritage becomes part of my family too. That's how this works." Kai's eyes were bright with unshed tears. "The soldiers tried to beat our language out of us, tried to make us forget our songs, and you want to learn them?" "I do." So they taught him, patiently, laughing at his terrible pronunciation, correcting his rhythm, but clearly moved that he was trying. And in return, Elias taught them some of the old frontier ballads he knew, the working songs from his timber camp days. Later, after the younger children had been tucked into their new beds upstairs, the boys sharing one large room, the girls another, Elias sat with the older four on the front porch despite the cold. "I want you to know," he said, "that I don't expect you to forget where you came from. I'm not trying to make you white or civilized or any of that nonsense the government spouts. Your culture, your language, your traditions, those are yours to keep and pass down. All I'm offering is a safe place to do that keeping and passing down." "That's more than we expected to find," Caleb said quietly, "more than we hoped for." They sat in silence for a while, watching the stars emerge in the vast Montana sky. Finally, Kai spoke. "Our mother used to say that the spirits guide us to where we need to be. Even when we think we're lost, we're really being led. I didn't believe that anymore after the soldiers came. But now—" She paused. "Now I think maybe she was right." "Maybe she was," Elias agreed. "Or maybe we're all just doing our best to stumble through and find meaning where we can. Either way, I'm glad your stumbling brought you here." The days that followed fell into a rhythm that felt both strange and natural. Elias woke before dawn and found Caleb already in the barn, learning to milk the cows. They'd work together in comfortable silence, then wake the others for breakfast. Meals were chaotic, noisy affairs with 12 children talking over each other, telling stories, occasionally breaking into laughter that filled the house with life. The work was constant, but shared made it lighter. The girls became efficient at household tasks, cooking and cleaning and mending. The boys threw themselves into the outdoor work, learning ranching with the intensity of children who understood they were being given a chance at a new life. Elias taught them reading and writing in the evenings, using Sarah's old books and newspapers he'd saved. He was surprised at how much some of them already knew. Clearly their parents had valued education, and how quickly the younger ones picked up new skills. They taught him too. Cherokee words and phrases, traditional stories about the creation of the world and the spirits that inhabited everything, songs that had been passed down through generations. Skills like tracking, plant identification, and understanding weather patterns in ways his white education had never covered. 3 weeks after the children's arrival, the first test came. A rider appeared on the horizon mid-morning, heading straight for the ranch. Elias was in the north pasture with Caleb when they spotted him. "Inside," Elias said quietly. "Get everyone inside. Remember the story. You're my late wife's relatives from Pennsylvania. Orphaned 6 months ago. I'm your guardian. You've been here since September." Caleb nodded and took off running. By the time the rider reached the house, all 12 children were inside, looking appropriately domestic. Girls sewing, boys studying from books, everyone looking like they belonged. The rider was Jim Patterson, a neighboring rancher from 10 miles east. Good man, honest, but also the kind who'd follow the letter of the law, even when the spirit was questionable. "Elias," Jim greeted him, dismounting. "Haven't seen you in town for a while. Wanted to make sure you were all right out here." "I'm fine, Jim. Actually better than fine. Come in. Have some coffee." Jim followed him inside and stopped short at the sight of 12 children in the living room. "Well, I'll be damned. When did you start collecting kids?" Elias launched into the prepared story, keeping his tone casual and matter-of-fact. Sarah's distant relatives, tragic orphaning, legal guardianship. He had papers, forgeries he'd painstakingly created over the past weeks, showing his appointment as guardian. Jim looked around at the children, his expression unreadable. Elias held his breath. Then Jim broke into a wide smile. "Well, that explains why you haven't been to town. Got your hands full here." He addressed the children directly. "You kids are lucky to have landed with Elias. He's one of the good ones." The children murmured appropriate thanks, playing their roles perfectly. Tessa even climbed into Elias's lap, cementing the image of a man who'd taken in his family. After Jim left, promising to spread word in town so people wouldn't worry, Elias let out a breath he hadn't known he was holding. "We did it," Kai said, wonder in her voice. "He believed us." "First test passed," Elias agreed, "but there will be more. We have to stay sharp." That night, they celebrated with an extra special dinner and stories around the fireplace. For the first time since arriving, the children seemed to fully believe they might actually be safe. In bed that night, Elias stared at the ceiling and thought about how dramatically his life had changed in less than a month. His quiet, grief-stricken existence had been completely upended. His empty house was now bursting with noise and life and chaos, and he'd never been happier. He fell asleep thinking about Sarah, hoping somehow she could see this, hoping she'd understand that he hadn't forgotten her or replaced her, but that he'd finally found a way to honor what they'd dreamed of building together. A family. Not the one they'd planned, but a family nonetheless, built from broken pieces that had somehow found a way to fit. Winter arrived in Montana with the subtlety of a sledgehammer, bringing temperatures that froze water buckets solid overnight and winds that howled through the ranch like wounded animals. But inside the Granger house, warmth radiated from more than just the wood stove. The children had been with Elias for 2 months now, and the rhythm of their shared life had begun to feel less like a temporary arrangement and more like something permanent, something real. Then, on a gray December morning when frost painted every surface silver, 3 riders appeared on the eastern ridge. They weren't neighbors making social calls. Even from a distance, Elias could see the rigid posture, the official bearing, the gleam of government-issued rifles in saddle scabbards. His blood turned to ice. He was in the barn with Caleb and Joshua when he spotted them. "Inside this," he said, his voice deadly calm despite the fear clawing at his chest. "Right now. Get everyone upstairs into the bedrooms. Tell them to stay absolutely quiet no matter what they hear. Go!" The boys didn't ask questions. They'd been preparing for this moment since the day they arrived. Joshua sprinted toward the house while Caleb hesitated, his hand instinctively moving toward the knife he still carried everywhere. "I should stay with you," Caleb said. "No." Elias gripped the boy's shoulder. "You should protect the little ones. That's your job now. Let me handle this." Caleb's jaw tightened, but he nodded and ran. Elias watched him disappear into the house, then turned to face the approaching riders with his spine straight and his expression carefully neutral. His heart was pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears, but his hands were steady as he crossed the yard to meet them. The 3 men reined in their horses 20 feet from the porch. The one in the center, a thin man with iron-gray hair and a face like chiseled granite, dismounted with the stiff movements of someone who'd spent too long in the saddle. A silver badge glinted on his coat. "You Elias Granger?" the man asked. "I am. And you are?" "Federal Agent Howard Crenshaw. These are Deputy Marshals Yates and Morrison." He gestured to the 2 younger men flanking him, both of whom were watching Elias with the wary attention of men who'd been told to expect trouble. "We're looking for some children, Cherokee children who escaped from a transport convoy back in September. 12 of them, ages 5 to 14. Elias felt sweat prickle at the back of his neck despite the cold, but he kept his face impassive. "That's terrible, but I haven't seen any Cherokee children around here, just my family and my cattle." Crenshaw's eyes narrowed. "Your family? Reports say you've been living alone out here for 3 years. "Reports are outdated." Elias crossed his arms, making himself as large and immovable as possible. "My late wife had relatives back east. They died in an accident last summer, left behind 12 children. I'm their legal guardian now. They've been living with me since September." The timing was deliberate. If Crenshaw was tracking the escaped children, September was when they'd disappeared. Elias was claiming the same time frame, making it clear his story wasn't being invented on the spot to cover for recent arrivals. "Quite a coincidence," Crenshaw said dryly. "You take in 12 orphans the same month 12 Cherokee children vanish. Not a coincidence, just unfortunate timing for your investigation. But I assure you the children in my house are my legal wards. I have paperwork to prove it." "I'd like to see that paperwork. And I'd like to see the children." This was the moment Elias had been dreading. He could refuse, try to keep the agent away from the house, but that would only make Crenshaw more suspicious. Better to appear cooperative, confident in his fabricated story. "Of course," Elias said smoothly. "Though I'll ask you to be respectful. They've been through enough trauma losing their parents. They don't need strange men with guns frightening them." Crenshaw's expression didn't soften. "We're not here to frighten children, Mr. Granger. We're here to recover stolen government property." The words hit Elias like a physical blow. Property. That's how this man saw 12 terrified children, not as human beings with rights and feelings, but as property that had wandered off. "The children in my house," Elias said, his voice dropping to a dangerous rumble, "are not property. They're orphans under my legal protection. There's a difference." "We'll see about that." Crenshaw started toward the house. Elias fell into step beside him, positioning himself between the agent and the door. The two marshals followed at a distance, hands resting on their gun belts in a way that was probably meant to be intimidating. Inside, the house was eerily quiet. Too quiet. Elias could feel the children hiding upstairs, probably pressed against the bedroom doors, trying to hear what was happening. His heart ached for them, for the terror they must be feeling. "Wait here," Elias said when they entered the living room. He went to his desk and pulled out the carefully forged documents he'd been working on for weeks. Guardian papers with official-looking seals, letters from fictional Pennsylvania lawyers, even a fabricated will from the children's deceased parents, naming Elias as their chosen guardian. He'd spent hours at the Shepherd's Bend courthouse studying real documents, learning the language, the formats, the signatures. The forgeries were good. He prayed they were good enough. Crenshaw examined them with the thoroughness of a man who'd seen plenty of fake papers in his career. Minutes ticked by. Elias stood perfectly still, his face betraying nothing of the terror racing through his veins. Finally, Crenshaw looked up. "These appear to be in order, but documents can be forged. I still need to see the children. If they're really your wife's relatives, they'll have family resemblances, physical characteristics that match what we'd expect." "They're mixed heritage," Elias said, improvising frantically. "Sarah's family had some Cherokee blood going back a few generations. It's why the children look the way they do." It was a desperate addition to the story, but it provided cover for the children's appearances. Crenshaw studied him for a long moment, and Elias could see the man calculating, trying to decide if this was truth or an elaborate lie. "Bring them down," Crenshaw ordered. "All of them, now." Elias climbed the stairs with legs that felt like lead. At the top, he found all 12 children crowded in the hallway, their faces pale with fear. Caleb stood in front, positioned between the younger ones and any threat. Kai was beside him, and both of them looked ready to fight despite being hopelessly outgunned. "Listen to me," Elias whispered urgently. "The agent wants to see you. You need to come downstairs and act natural. You're my wards, my family. You've been here since September. Your parents died in Pennsylvania. Remember the story, every detail. If anyone hesitates or contradicts someone else, he'll know we're lying." "What if he recognizes us?" Alina whispered, her voice shaking. "He won't. You've gained weight, you're wearing different clothes, and you're claiming different names. Just stay calm and follow my lead." Tessa pushed forward and grabbed Elias's hand. "Are they going to take us away?" Elias knelt down, bringing himself to her eye level. "Not if I have anything to say about it." "Trust me, sweetheart. Can you do that?" She nodded, her small chin trembling but determined. They descended the stairs together, 12 children and one oversized rancher who was silently begging the universe to let this work. In the living room, Crenshaw and his marshals stood waiting, their expressions giving nothing away. The children arranged themselves naturally, the older ones positioning themselves protectively around the younger. Elias was struck by how much they'd changed in 2 months. They'd filled out, their faces no longer gaunt with starvation. They wore clean, well-fitting clothes adapted from Sarah's things and cloth Elias had purchased from the general store. They looked cared for, healthy, loved. They looked like family. Crenshaw walked slowly along the line of children, studying each one. His gaze lingered on Caleb, on Kai, on the distinctive features that marked them as Cherokee. Elias held his breath. "Names," Crenshaw said sharply. One by one, the children spoke. Caleb Granger, Kai Granger, Alina Granger. Down the line, each one claiming the name that offered protection, that said they belonged here, that declared them part of something the government couldn't easily touch. When Crenshaw reached Tessa, she looked up at him with those enormous dark eyes and said, her voice clear and steady, "Tessa Granger. And that's my papa." She pointed at Elias. Something shifted in Crenshaw's expression. Just for a moment, the hard agent's mask slipped, and Elias caught a glimpse of something that might have been doubt, or maybe even discomfort with his mission. "You understand," Crenshaw said to Elias, "that harboring escaped government wards is a federal crime? That lying to a federal agent carries serious consequences? I understand that the children in my care are here legally, under proper guardianship, and are not your missing wards." Elias kept his voice level despite the anger rising in him. "I understand that you're doing your job, but I also understand that I'm doing mine, which is protecting my family." "Your family?" Crenshaw's tone was skeptical. "Awfully convenient, isn't it? 12 children who just happen to be the right ages, the right ethnicity?" "The right ethnicity?" Elias interrupted, his temper finally breaking through his carefully maintained calm. "What exactly does that mean, Agent Crenshaw? Are you suggesting that Cherokee blood makes someone government property? That having native ancestry means children can be stolen from their homes and shipped off to schools designed to destroy their culture?" "I'm suggesting," Crenshaw said coldly, "that the government has a legal responsibility to educate and civilize tribal children. Those children who escaped were being transported for their own good." "Their own good?" Elias took a step forward, using his size deliberately now, letting Crenshaw see exactly how large and angry he was. "Tell me, Agent, what's good about tearing children away from their families? What's civilized about beating them for speaking their own language? What's educational about forcing them to forget who they are?" "You're overstepping, Mr. Granger." "No, you're overstepping, coming onto my land, into my home, calling my children property." Elias's voice had dropped to a dangerous rumble. "I've been patient. I've shown you my documents. I've let you interrogate children who've already been traumatized enough for one lifetime. Now I'm asking you politely to leave my property." Crenshaw's hand moved toward his coat, and both marshals tensed. For a heartbeat, Elias thought they might actually try to arrest him, might try to take the children by force. He planted his feet, prepared to fight if necessary. Behind him, he heard Caleb move, positioning himself to protect the younger ones. Then Crenshaw's hand moved away from his coat. "This isn't over," he said. "I'm going to verify every detail of your story, Mr. Granger. If I find one inconsistency, one piece of evidence that you're lying, I'll be back with enough marshals to take those children and charge you with a list of crimes long enough to put you away for years." "You do that," Elias said. "Check every detail. You'll find everything in order, because these are my children, and I have every right to care for them." Crenshaw stared at him for a long moment, then turned sharply and headed for the door. The marshals followed, casting uncertain looks back at the children. As they reached the porch, Crenshaw paused. "One more thing," he called back. Those missing Cherokee children? There's a significant reward for information leading to their recovery. Might want to keep that in mind if you happen to hear anything. It was a last attempt to shake Elias's resolve, to tempt him with money. It failed spectacularly. I'll keep it in mind, Elias said flatly. Now get off my land. They watched from the windows as the three men mounted their horses and rode away. No one moved or spoke until the riders had disappeared over the ridge. Then, like strings being cut, several of the children sank to the floor. Tessa was crying silently, her whole small body shaking. Elias scooped her up, holding her against his chest as she sobbed. Around them, the other children were in various states of distress. Ruth and Naomi were clinging to each other. Marcus had his face buried in Alina's shoulder. The boys looked shell-shocked. Only Caleb and Kai remained standing, their faces hard with anger and lingering fear. He didn't believe us, Kai said. He's going to check the story. When he can't verify it, he'll find enough to create doubt, Elias interrupted. The Pennsylvania records I referenced are real. I made sure of that. The lawyer I named exists. The accident I described actually happened, just to a different family. There's enough truth mixed with the lies that he won't be able to prove anything definitively. But he suspects. Caleb's voice was tight. Yes, he suspects. Elias met the boy's eyes over Tessa's curly head, which means we need to be more careful than ever. No mistakes, no slips. We stick to the story completely, with everyone, all the time. What if that's not enough? Alina asked, her voice small. What if he comes back with more men? What if he just takes us anyway? Elias set Tessa down gently and moved to the center of the room where all the children could see him. Then we go to the next level of defense. I have a lawyer friend in Helena, a good man who owes me a favor. If Crenshaw tries anything, we'll fight him in court. We'll make enough noise that the newspapers pick it up. We'll turn this into a public battle that the government would rather avoid. You'd really do that? Samuel asked. Risk everything? I told you before, Elias said firmly. You're mine now, all of you, and I don't let anyone hurt what's mine. The afternoon passed in a strange, tense quiet. The children did their chores mechanically, but the joy that had been building over the past 2 months was muted. They were frightened, and Elias couldn't blame them. He was frightened too, though he tried not to show it. That evening, he gathered them all in the living room. I want to talk about what happened today, he said, about what it means and what we do next. The children settled around him, the younger ones claiming spots close to his chair, the older ones arranging themselves protectively around their siblings. It was a formation they'd unconsciously adopted, a family unit closing ranks against external threat. First, Elias said, I want you to know that you were all incredibly brave today. Every single one of you kept your composure, remembered the story, and didn't give Crenshaw any ammunition to use against us. I'm proud of you. I was so scared, Tessa whispered. I thought he was going to make us leave. I know you were scared, sweetheart, but you didn't let that fear control you. That takes real courage. What happens now? Caleb asked. He was sitting on the floor with his back against the wall, positioned where he could see both doors, still on guard, still protecting. Now we wait, Elias said. Crenshaw will investigate. He'll send inquiries to Pennsylvania, try to verify our story. It'll take weeks, maybe months, for responses to come back. During that time, we continue as we have been. We go to town when necessary, we interact with neighbors, we act like the family we've claimed to be. The more normal we appear, the less suspicious it looks. What if someone in town recognizes us? Naomi asked. What if there are wanted posters or descriptions? There probably are, Elias admitted, but you look different now than you did 2 months ago. Better fed, better dressed, more confident. People see what they expect to see. If they expect to see my wards, my family, that's what they'll see. Kai was studying him intently. You've thought about this a lot, haven't you? All the angles, all the possibilities. I've thought about little else for the past 2 months, Elias confirmed. Every night after you're all asleep, I lie awake running scenarios, planning contingencies, trying to stay 3 steps ahead of people like Crenshaw. He paused, then added quietly, I won't let them take you. I mean that. If it comes down to it, we'll leave Montana entirely. We'll go somewhere they can't find us. You'd give up your ranch? Marcus looked stunned. This place you built with your wife? This place was supposed to be about family, Elias said, about building a home and raising children and creating something that mattered. Sarah and I never got to do that. But you 12 have given me a second chance at that dream. The land matters, but you matter more. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Caleb stood up and crossed the room to Elias. He didn't say anything, just held out his hand. Elias took it, and Caleb's grip was firm, almost painful in its intensity. We'll fight, Caleb said. If they come back, we won't just run and hide. We'll stand with you and fight. Me too, Kai said, standing. All of us, Alina added, and one by one, the other children rose, forming a circle around Elias's chair, a declaration of unity, a family choosing to stand together. Elias looked at their faces, these 12 souls who'd come to him starving and terrified and had somehow become the center of his world, and felt something fierce and protective surge through him. They were his. Not because of blood or law or any government document, but because they'd chosen each other in the way that mattered most. Then we'll face whatever comes together, he said, as a family. The days following Crenshaw's visit were tense. Every time a rider appeared on the horizon, every unexpected sound, every stranger in Shepherd's Bend when they went for supplies, all of it set everyone's nerves on edge. But weeks passed and Crenshaw didn't return. Life gradually settled back into its rhythm, though with an undercurrent of wariness that hadn't been there before. Christmas approached and Elias found himself planning a celebration with an enthusiasm that surprised him. He'd ignored the holiday for 3 years, unable to bear the reminder of what he'd lost. But the children deserved joy, deserved normalcy, deserved to feel like the family they were claiming to be. He took Caleb and Kai to town with him to purchase supplies, partly because he needed their help carrying everything, and partly because he wanted the town to see them, to become accustomed to the Granger children as a normal part of the landscape. In the general store, they ran into Jim Patterson and his wife, Martha. The couple had visited the ranch twice since that first meeting, bringing supplies and neighborly gossip. They'd seemed to genuinely accept Elias's story about the orphaned relatives. Planning quite a Christmas, Jim observed, noting the bags of sugar, flour, and dried fruit Elias was purchasing. Your kids must be excited. They are, Elias said. It's been a hard year for them, losing their parents. I want to give them something good to remember. Martha smiled warmly at Kai. How are you settling in, dear? Must be quite an adjustment from Pennsylvania to Montana. Kai didn't miss a beat. It's different, ma'am, colder, but beautiful in its own way. And Uncle Elias has been very kind to us. Uncle. The word had been Kai's idea, a way to acknowledge the relationship without claiming full parent-child status too quickly. It felt right, natural, and apparently it satisfied Martha. Well, you tell those younger siblings of yours that I'll be bringing by some gingerbread next week, Martha said. Can't have Christmas without proper gingerbread. As they loaded supplies into the wagon, Elias noticed a new poster on the telegraph office wall. His blood ran cold. It was a wanted notice for escaped Cherokee children, offering a reward of $500, a fortune by most standards, for information leading to their recovery. The poster included rough descriptions but no drawings. Elias quickly assessed it. The descriptions were vague enough. Ages 5 to 14, dark hair, Cherokee features, that they could apply to hundreds of children across the territory. Without specific identifying information, the poster wasn't an immediate threat, but it was a reminder that they weren't safe, that somewhere people were still looking. On the ride home, Caleb asked quietly, "Did you see the poster?" "I did." $500 is a lot of money. Someone in town might get tempted. Maybe, Elias acknowledged, but most folks around here are decent, and more importantly, you've been seen with me multiple times now. You're established as my wards. Anyone trying to claim you're the escaped children would have to prove it, and we've got documents saying otherwise. Documents you forged, Kai pointed out. Documents that will hold up to scrutiny because I was very, very careful when I made them. Elias glanced at both of them. I need you to trust me on this. I know it's hard. I know you've learned that trust gets you hurt, but I'm asking you to have faith that I know what I'm doing. They rode in silence for a while. Then Caleb said, We do trust you. That's what makes this so terrifying. Because if something happens to you, if they arrest you or worse, we lose the only person who's fought for us in months. Elias hadn't thought about it from that angle, that his role as protector made him a single point of failure. If something happened to him, the children would be vulnerable again. Then we need a backup plan, he said. If anything happens to me, you take the children and go to my lawyer friend in Helena. His name is Robert Thornton. I'll write you a letter to give him, explaining everything. He'll help you. We won't leave you, Kai said stubbornly. Yes, you will, Elias said firmly. Because protecting you is the priority. Always. Even if that means you have to leave me behind. Back at the ranch, Christmas preparations became a welcome distraction from the underlying tension. The children threw themselves into making decorations from pine boughs, stringing popcorn, creating ornaments from whatever materials they could find. The house filled with the smell of baking as the older girls worked through Sarah's old recipes, making cookies and cakes and pies. Elias carved small toys for the younger children, working late into the night in the barn so it would be a surprise. A wooden horse for Tessa, dolls for Ruth and Naomi, tops for the boys. For the older children, he purchased books, adventure stories, poetry, even a Cherokee language primer he'd found through a mail-order catalog from back east. On Christmas Eve, they decorated a pine tree that Elias and the boys had cut from the North Ridge. As they hung ornaments and lit candles, someone started singing. It was a Cherokee song taught by the children's parents before they'd been taken. Other voices joined in, harmonizing in ways that made the hair stand up on Elias's arms. When the song ended, Tessa tugged on his sleeve. Do you know any Christmas songs from when you were little? Elias thought back to his own childhood, to singing carols with his mother before she died, before his father had drunk himself into an early grave. He began singing Silent Night, his deep voice carrying the melody. The children listened, and then slowly they joined in, learning the words as they went. Later that night, after the younger ones were in bed, Elias sat with the older four by the fireplace. They'd fallen into this habit, these late-night conversations where they could speak freely about their fears and hopes without worrying about frightening the little ones. I have something for all of you, Elias said. He pulled out a wooden box he'd kept hidden in his room. Inside were 12 legal documents, each one a formal adoption petition. These are ready to be filed when we think it's safe. When enough time has passed that Crenshaw and his people have given up searching. They'll make you my legal children, with all the rights and protections that entails. Kai took one of the documents with shaking hands, reading through the legal language. Kai Riverwind Granger, she read aloud. You kept our real names. Your birth names are part of who you are, Elias said. I'm not asking you to erase that. I'm asking you to add to it, to let me be part of your family the same way you're part of mine. Alina was crying silently, tears streaming down her face. I never thought I'd have a family again. After they took our parents, I thought that was it, that we'd always be alone. You're not alone, Elias said, his own voice rough with emotion. You'll never be alone again as long as I'm breathing. Caleb stared at his own document for a long time. My father would have liked you, he said finally. He always said that a man's worth wasn't in his blood or his skin, but in his actions. You've proven your worth 1,000 times over. Your father sounds like he was a wise man. I wish I could have known him. He would have said the same about you. They sat in companionable silence, watching the fire burn down to embers. Outside, snow had begun to fall, soft and steady, blanketing the ranch in white. Inside, warmth and love and the feeling of family surrounded them. On Christmas morning, the children woke to find gifts waiting and a feast that Elias had been secretly preparing for days. There was laughter and joy and the kind of chaotic happiness that only comes from a house full of children on Christmas morning. For a few precious hours, they forgot about federal agents and wanted posters and the danger that still lurked beyond their gates. For a few precious hours, they were simply a family celebrating together. But in the back of Elias's mind, he knew this peace was fragile. Crenshaw hadn't given up. The wanted posters were still circulating. The threat hadn't vanished. It had only retreated temporarily, gathering strength for another attempt. And when it came, because Elias was certain it would come, he would be ready. He'd fight with every resource he had, every ounce of strength, every legal maneuver available. because these 12 children weren't just wards under his protection anymore. They weren't just orphans he'd taken in out of kindness. They were his family, his children, his reason for living, and he would die before he let anyone take them away. Spring came late to Montana that year, the snow clinging stubbornly to the northern ridges well into April. But when it finally arrived, it brought with it an explosion of wildflowers across the meadows and a sense of renewal that seemed to mirror the transformation happening within the Granger family. The children had been with Elias for 6 months now, and the fearful, half-starved refugees who'd stumbled onto his ranch had become confident, healthy young people who moved through their days with purpose and belonging. Caleb had grown 2 inches and filled out through the shoulders, his body finally getting the nutrition it had been denied for so long. He worked alongside Elias every day, learning not just ranching but the business side of things, how to calculate profit margins, when to buy and sell cattle, how to negotiate with buyers. Elias had started teaching him to read legal documents, saying, "You need to know how to protect yourself in a world that's designed to take advantage of people who look like you." Kai had discovered a talent for healing, her knowledge of traditional Cherokee medicine combining with information from the few medical books Elias owned to create something unique and valuable. When Jim Patterson's wife had fallen ill with a fever that winter, it was Kai who'd known which herbs to use, who'd stayed up 3 nights straight monitoring Martha's condition. Word had spread, and now people from neighboring ranches would occasionally ride over seeking Kai's help with various ailments. It gave her status in the community, made her someone valued rather than feared. The other children were thriving too. Alina had taken over most of the cooking and had a natural gift for it, transforming simple ingredients into meals that had even crusty old Jim Patterson declaring she'd make some lucky man a fine wife someday. Marcus had overcome his initial shyness and now chatted freely with anyone who'd listen, his intelligence and curiosity evident in every conversation. The younger ones were growing like weeds, their laughter a constant soundtrack to life on the ranch. But the shadow of Agent Crenshaw still hung over them all. He'd sent 2 more deputies in February, different men but with the same suspicious eyes, asking the same questions. Each time Elias had produced his documents, the children had recited their stories flawlessly, and the deputies had left without finding anything concrete to contradict the established narrative. But the visits were reminders that they weren't safe, that the government hadn't forgotten about 12 missing Cherokee children. On a bright morning in early May, Elias was in the barn showing Thomas and Joshua how to properly shoe a horse when he heard the sound of multiple riders approaching. His stomach dropped. More visitors. But when he looked out, he saw something that made his blood run cold. It wasn't 2 or 3 riders this time. It was a dozen. And leading them was Agent Crenshaw himself, accompanied by a man in an expensive suit and enough armed marshals to make it clear this wasn't a social call. "Boys, get to the house," Elias said quietly. "Tell Caleb code red. You remember what that means?" Thomas nodded, his face pale. Code red was their emergency plan. Gather everyone, prepare to defend or flee, depending on what developed. The boys ran. Elias walked out to meet the riders, his heart pounding but his face carefully neutral. This was it. Whatever Crenshaw had been planning for the past 6 months, it was happening now. The riders formed a semicircle around him, cutting off easy access to the house. Crenshaw dismounted, and the man in the expensive suit followed. Up close, Elias could see the suit was tailored, the man's shoes polished to a mirror shine. This was someone with power and money, someone who expected to be obeyed. "Mr. Granger," Crenshaw said, and there was something like triumph in his voice. "I'd like you to meet Judge Harrison Blackwell from the Territorial Court in Helena. He's obtained a warrant to remove the children from your custody pending a full investigation into your guardianship claims." The words hit like physical blows. A warrant. A judge. This wasn't a fishing expedition anymore. This was a legal seizure. "On what grounds?" Elias demanded, his voice steady despite the panic screaming through his veins. Judge Blackwell stepped forward, pulling a document from his coat. "On the grounds that substantial evidence has come to light suggesting the children in your care are, in fact, escaped wards of the federal government. Evidence that your guardianship documents are fraudulent. Evidence that you have knowingly harbored fugitives and obstructed a federal investigation." "What evidence?" Elias asked. "I've provided every document requested. The children have verified their identities. What more do you want?" "The Pennsylvania lawyer you cited as handling the original guardianship," Crenshaw said, unable to keep the smugness from his voice. Took 3 months, but we finally got a response. He has no record of any guardianship case involving your name or anyone named Granger. The accident you described? It happened, but to a different family. The will you produced? The signature doesn't match any known writing samples from the supposed deceased. Elias felt the ground shifting beneath him. They'd found the holes in his fabricated story. After 6 months of investigation, they'd pulled the threads until the whole thing unraveled. Furthermore, Judge Blackwell continued, we have testimony from a merchant in Shepherd's Bend who swears the children didn't appear in town until late November, despite your claims they arrived in September. We have descriptions from the original transport convoy that match several of your wards exactly. You have circumstantial evidence and coincidences, Elias interrupted, his voice hard. You have a theory you want to be true because it makes your job easier, but you don't have proof. We have enough for this warrant, Blackwell said coldly. He nodded to the marshals. Remove the children from the premises. Use force if necessary. The marshals started forward, and something primitive and fierce rose up in Elias. His hands clenched into fists, and he stepped directly into their path, using every inch of his 6'7" frame to maximum effect. You'll have to go through me first, he said quietly. Mr. Granger, resisting a lawful order, Blackwell began. Those children are terrified of government men in uniform because government men in uniform destroyed their families, Elias said, his voice rising. You want to take them. You want to drag them back to schools where they'll be beaten for speaking their own language? Where they'll be stripped of everything that makes them who they are? Then yes, you'll have to go through me. And I promise you, it won't be easy. The marshals hesitated, clearly not eager to physically fight a man of Elias's size. Crenshaw's face darkened with anger. You're making this worse for yourself. Stand aside or we'll add assault of a federal officer to your charges. Behind him, Elias heard the house door open. He didn't turn around, but he knew without looking that the children had come out. All 12 of them, probably standing on the porch watching this confrontation unfold. These are my children, Elias said, loud enough for everyone to hear. My family. I don't care what your warrants say. I don't care about your investigations. They're mine, and I'm not letting you take them. Your children? Judge Blackwell's voice dripped with contempt. They're savages, Mr. Granger. Indians who need to be civilized, educated, made into productive members of society. Your sentimental attachment doesn't change their legal status. My sentimental attachment? Elias felt rage like he'd never known coursing through him. These aren't pets I've grown fond of. They're human beings. Children who've been traumatized and terrorized by people like you who think you have the right to decide what's best for them without ever bothering to ask what they want. What they want is irrelevant, Blackwell said. They're minors and wards of the government. The law is clear. The law is wrong. The words hung in the air, a direct challenge to everything Blackwell represented. The judge's face flushed red with anger. Marshal Thompson, remove this man from the premises, he ordered. 2 marshals moved forward. Elias braced himself, prepared to fight, to buy the children time to run if nothing else. But before anyone could make contact, a voice rang out from the porch. Wait! Everyone turned. Caleb had stepped forward, Kai right behind him. The boy who'd been 14 and starving 6 months ago now stood tall and strong, his chin up, his eyes blazing with determination. If you want to take us, Caleb said, then take us. But you'll be doing it over our objections. We'll testify in any court that we don't want to go, that Elias Granger saved our lives, that he's been a better father to us in 6 months than the government ever would be in 6 years. Your objections don't matter, Crenshaw started, but Kai cut him off. Then what does matter? She demanded. You talk about civilization and education, but what you really mean is making us forget we're Cherokee, making us ashamed of who we are. Elias taught us to read and write. He taught us ranching and business, but he also encouraged us to keep our language, our songs, our traditions. That's real education, not whatever you're offering in your boarding schools. One by one, the other children stepped forward, forming a line beside Caleb and Kai. Even little Tessa, who barely came up to the marshal's waist, stood with her hands on her hips and defiance in her eyes. We choose Mr. Elias, she said, her small voice carrying clearly in the morning air. He's our papa. You can't have us. Judge Blackwell looked genuinely taken aback by the united front. He'd clearly expected frightened children, easy to manipulate and remove. Instead, he was faced with a family standing together, willing to fight. "This is touching," he said, recovering his composure, "but it doesn't change the legal reality. Marshal Thompson, proceed with removing the children." The marshal started forward again, and this time Elias didn't move from his blocking position. The lead marshal, a younger man who looked distinctly uncomfortable with this entire situation, reached for Elias's arm. "Sir, please don't make this harder than it has to be." "It's already as hard as it can be," Elias said. "You're trying to destroy a family. How much harder does it get?" Behind them, more voices joined the fray. Jim Patterson and his wife Martha were riding up the road, along with several other neighboring families. Word had apparently spread that something was happening at the Granger Ranch, and the community had come to see what was going on. Jim dismounted and pushed through the marshals with the confidence of a man who'd lived in Montana since before it was officially a territory. "What in blazes is happening here, Elias?" "They're trying to take my children, Jim, claiming they're escaped government wards." Jim looked at Judge Blackwell, his weathered face skeptical. "These are Elias's wards. Been living here since last fall. Good kids, hard workers. What's this about government custody?" "These children," Blackwell said stiffly, "are Cherokee minors who escaped from federal transport last September. Mr. Granger has been harboring them illegally." Martha Patterson stepped forward, her matronly presence somehow commanding despite her small stature. "I've spent time with these children. They're well cared for, healthy, educated. What exactly would be gained by removing them from a good home?" "The law," Crenshaw began, but Martha cut him off with a look that would have withered a lesser man. "I don't care about your law if it's designed to hurt children. These kids have a home here, a family. What you're proposing is cruelty dressed up as policy." More neighbors were arriving now, drawn by some mysterious frontier telegraph that always seemed to know when something significant was happening. The Hendersons, the Crosses, old Thomas Weatherby from the ranch to the south. All of them people who'd met the Granger children over the past months, who'd seen them at church socials and harvest gatherings, who'd accepted them as part of the community. And all of them, Elias realized with growing hope, looked angry at what they were witnessing. Thomas Weatherby, who had to be pushing 70 and had lived through more than most men saw in 2 lifetimes, walked right up to Judge Blackwell and poked him in the chest with a gnarled finger. "You listen here, fancy pants. I've known Elias Granger for 5 years. He's honest, hardworking, and decent. If he says these are his wards, then they're his wards. And if you think a piece of paper from some government office gives you the right to come out here and terrorize children, then you've got another think coming." Blackwell sputtered, clearly not accustomed to being challenged by ordinary citizens. "This is a legal matter under federal jurisdiction. Your opinions are irrelevant." "Our opinions are damn relevant when you're trying to conduct your legal matter in our community," Jim Patterson said. "And I'm telling you right now, you take those children against their will, you're going to have a problem. A big problem." The tension was escalating rapidly. The marshals looked increasingly uncomfortable, caught between their orders and the growing crowd of angry ranchers. Elias could see Crenshaw calculating, trying to figure out if they could physically remove the children without sparking a riot. Then a new voice cut through the chaos, calm and authoritative. "Perhaps we should all take a step back and approach this rationally." A man on horseback was approaching from the direction of town, dressed in a good suit but not ostentatiously expensive like Blackwell's. He was middle-aged, with kind eyes and an air of quiet competence. Elias recognized him immediately and felt a surge of relief so profound it nearly buckled his knees. Robert Thornton, his lawyer friend from Helena, the backup plan he'd mentioned to Caleb months ago. Thornton dismounted and pulled a leather case from his saddlebag. "Judge Blackwell, I'm Robert Thornton, attorney at law. I represent Mr. Granger and his wards. I've been retained to ensure that any legal proceedings regarding this family are conducted properly and with due process." Blackwell's eyes narrowed. "This warrant is valid and binding." "I don't dispute the warrant's validity," Thornton said smoothly. "However, I do question whether its execution at this moment in this manner serves the interests of justice. These children have been established in this community for 6 months. They're clearly healthy and well cared for. Removing them forcibly without a proper hearing seems precipitous, to say the least." The hearing will take place in Helena, Blackwell said, after the children are in federal custody. Or, Thornton suggested, we could arrange a hearing here in Shepherd's Bend where the community can testify to what they've observed, where the children themselves can be heard in an environment where they feel safe rather than intimidated. It was a brilliant move. By offering a compromise, Thornton was taking the moral high ground while also buying time and ensuring any hearing would be on friendly territory with friendly witnesses. Blackwell clearly saw the trap, but couldn't figure a way out of it without looking like a tyrant. The federal government doesn't typically conduct hearings at the convenience of defendants. The federal government also doesn't typically have to worry about frontier justice, Thomas Weatherby interjected. But you keep pushing, and you might find out what that looks like. It wasn't quite a threat, but it was close. Elias saw several of the marshals shift uncomfortably, hands moving away from their weapons. They might have a legal warrant, but they were outnumbered by angry ranchers, and everyone knew how quickly situations like this could turn violent on the frontier. Thornton pressed his advantage. Judge Blackwell, I'm proposing a compromise that serves everyone's interests. Schedule a hearing for 2 weeks from now. In the meantime, the children remain in Mr. Granger's custody under the community's supervision. This gives you time to present your evidence properly, gives us time to prepare our defense, and prevents what could become a very ugly situation right here and now. Blackwell looked around at the crowd of settlers, at Elias standing like an immovable wall in front of his children, at the 12 kids themselves standing united and defiant. Elias could see him doing the math, calculating the political cost of forcing this issue right now versus accepting a strategic delay. Finally, Blackwell nodded stiffly. 2 weeks. But if Mr. Granger or any of these children attempt to flee, I'll have warrants issued for their arrest on federal charges. Is that clear? Crystal clear, Thornton said. My clients have no intention of fleeing. They'll be present for the hearing and prepared to defend their family in a court of law. Crenshaw looked like he wanted to protest, but Blackwell silenced him with a look. 2 weeks. Shepherd's Bend Courthouse. Be prepared to prove your claims, Mr. Thornton, because I'll be prepared to demolish them. I look forward to it, Thornton said calmly. The federal delegation mounted their horses and rode away, Crenshaw looking back over his shoulder with an expression that promised this wasn't over. The moment they disappeared from view, Elias felt his knees go weak. He leaned against the fence, breathing hard, the adrenaline that had been sustaining him suddenly draining away. The neighbors crowded around, offering support and reassurances. Martha hugged each of the children, telling them they were brave. Jim clasped Elias's shoulder, his grip firm and supportive. Thomas Weatherby was already organizing a defense fund, declaring that if Elias needed money for lawyers or anything else, the community would provide it. Through it all, Thornton stood quietly to the side, waiting for the chaos to die down. When the neighbors finally dispersed, promising to be at the hearing and to bring everyone they knew, Elias turned to his old friend. "How did you know to come?" he asked. Thornton smiled slightly. "You wrote me 6 months ago about a delicate legal situation. When I heard there was federal activity heading toward your ranch, I thought it might be prudent to make an appearance. You saved us today." "I bought you time," Thornton corrected. "But we've got a real fight ahead, Elias. Blackwell isn't going to back down easily, and Crenshaw has spent months building his case. We need to build ours." They moved inside, and for the next several hours, Thornton questioned everyone. Elias about how he'd created the false documents, the children about their actual histories, what their lives had been like before they'd escaped. He took notes in a leather journal, his expression growing more thoughtful as the stories unfolded. When he'd heard everything, Thornton sat back and rubbed his eyes. "This is going to be complicated. The children's testimonies are powerful, but legally, their status as minors means their preferences carry limited weight. The forged documents work against us. They establish that Elias knowingly deceived authorities." "So what do we do?" Caleb asked. He'd been sitting quietly through the entire interview, but the strain was evident in his voice. "We do several things," Thornton said. "First, we establish that regardless of how this arrangement began, it's working. We bring in every neighbor, every community member who's interacted with these children. We show that they're thriving, not suffering. Second, we challenge the federal government's jurisdiction. Montana territorial law gives significant weight to local guardianship arrangements. Third, we make the case that separating the children now would cause genuine harm, trauma that outweighs any benefit from returning them to federal custody. Will it be enough? Kai asked. I don't know, Thornton admitted. Judge Blackwell is a federal appointee with ties to the Indian Affairs Office. He's predisposed to side with the government. But we have community support, we have the children's testimonies, and we have the fact that frontier justice operates differently than Eastern law. If we can make this about children's welfare rather than legal technicalities, we have a chance. Over the next 2 weeks, the Granger Ranch became a hub of activity. Neighbors came by daily, offering support and coordinating testimony. Thornton worked around the clock preparing the defense, interviewing witnesses, researching precedents. The children themselves were questioned repeatedly, Thornton preparing them for what to expect in the hearing and how to respond to hostile questioning. Elias spent his nights lying awake, terrified that he'd led the children into a trap they couldn't escape. During the day, he maintained a facade of confidence, but in the dark hours before dawn, the fear was overwhelming. What if they lost? What if his attempt to save these children ended up being what condemned them? On the night before the hearing, after the children were in bed, Thornton and Elias sat on the porch with whiskey. Neither of them was drinking. You know there's a real possibility we lose tomorrow, Thornton said quietly. If that happens, you're looking at criminal charges. Harboring fugitives, forging legal documents, obstruction of justice. Could be years in prison. I know. And you still won't back down. Won't consider some kind of deal where you avoid prosecution in exchange for surrendering the children? Elias looked out at the dark shapes of the ranch buildings, the land he'd built with Sarah, the home that had been empty for so long and was now full of life and laughter. He thought about 12 pairs of eyes watching him, trusting him, believing he could protect them. No deals, he said. We go down fighting, or we win. Those are the only two options. Thornton nodded slowly. Then we'd better make damn sure we win. The next morning dawned clear and cold, the kind of perfect spring day that seemed cruelly at odds with what they were facing. They rode into Shepherd's Bend as a family, all 13 of them in the big wagon, dressed in their Sunday best, trying to project confidence none of them felt. The courthouse was packed. Every seat was filled with townspeople and ranchers from miles around, come to witness what everyone knew was a fight for the soul of their community. On one side sat Agent Crenshaw and his team, surrounded by federal marshals. On the other sat the Granger family, flanked by neighbors who'd become friends and allies. Judge Blackwell entered, and the bailiff called for order. The hearing that would determine the fate of 12 children and one oversized rancher was about to begin. And Elias, sitting with his children pressed close around him, sent up a silent prayer to whatever God might be listening that justice would prevail over law, that humanity would triumph over bureaucracy, that love would prove stronger than government decree. Then the judge's gavel fell, and there was no more time for prayer. Only time to fight. The gavel's crack echoed through the packed courthouse like a gunshot, and Elias felt every muscle in his body tense. Judge Blackwell surveyed the room with cold authority, his expression making it clear he considered this hearing a formality before rendering what he'd already decided was the correct verdict. This hearing will determine the custody status of 12 minors currently residing with Elias Granger, Blackwell announced. The federal government contends these children are escaped wards who should be returned to proper supervision. Mr. Granger claims legal guardianship. We'll hear evidence from both sides and render a decision based on the law, not sentiment or emotion. The last words were clearly directed at the packed gallery of supportive townspeople. Blackwell wanted everyone to know he wouldn't be swayed by frontier solidarity or community pressure. Agent Crenshaw stood first, presenting his case with the methodical precision of someone who'd spent months building it. He produced the original transport manifest showing 12 Cherokee children being moved to a boarding school in South Dakota. He documented their escape in September. He presented testimony from the transport guards describing each child in detail, descriptions that matched Elias's wards almost perfectly. Then Crenshaw laid out the evidence against Elias's guardianship claim, the Pennsylvania lawyer who had no record of the case, the will with forged signatures, the accident that had happened to a different family, the timeline inconsistencies. Each piece of evidence was damning, and Elias watched the judge's expression grow increasingly convinced. Furthermore, Crenshaw concluded, We have evidence that Mr. Granger deliberately concealed these children from federal authorities. He created false documents, coached the children to lie about their identities, and actively obstructed our investigation. These actions demonstrate consciousness of guilt and complete disregard for the law. When Crenshaw sat down, the courtroom was silent. The case against them seemed overwhelming. Several of the younger children were crying quietly, and Elias wanted nothing more than to gather them all up and run, consequences be damned. But Thornton stood with the calm confidence of someone who'd been waiting for exactly this moment. Your Honor, the government's case rests on documentation and technicalities. I'd like to present a different kind of evidence, the evidence of what's actually happening in the lives of these 12 children. Because the law exists to serve people, not the other way around. Blackwell frowned. The law exists to maintain order and protect the interests of society. And these children are part of society, Thornton countered smoothly. They're not abstract legal problems to be filed away. They're human beings whose welfare should be our primary concern. With your permission, I'd like to call my first witness. Blackwell nodded grudgingly. I call Caleb Granger to the stand. Elias's heart clenched as Caleb stood and walked to the witness chair. The boy looked so young despite his growth over the past months, so vulnerable sitting alone in that wooden chair with every eye in the courthouse on him. Thornton approached gently. Caleb, would you tell the court your name and age? My name is Caleb Redfeather Granger. I'm 15 years old. And where were you born? In the Black Hills Territory. My father was Cherokee. My mother was Lakota. They had a small ranch where they raised horses. Past tense, Thornton noted quietly. What happened to them? Caleb's voice was steady but filled with pain. Federal agents came 3 years ago, said our land was being reassigned to white settlers. My father had legal deeds, purchased papers. They didn't care. They tore up the documents in front of us and gave us 2 days to leave. When my father tried to fight it legally, they arrested him. We never saw him again. The courtroom was absolutely silent. Even Blackwell looked uncomfortable. And your mother? She tried to keep us together. We moved to different reservations, but conditions were terrible. Not enough food, no real shelter. When the sickness came through 2 years ago, she didn't survive. Neither did my 2 youngest siblings. So you became responsible for the remaining children in your family group? Yes, sir. There were 12 of us by then. Some were my actual siblings, some were cousins, some were children whose parents had died or been taken. We looked out for each other. And then what happened? Caleb took a breath. Last September, federal agents rounded us up, said we were being sent to a boarding school in South Dakota for our own good. But we'd heard stories from other tribes about what happens in those schools, how they beat children for speaking their own languages, how they force them to forget their families and their heritage, how children die from disease and overwork and are buried in unmarked graves. Objection. Crenshaw stood abruptly. These are unsubstantiated rumors designed to prejudice the court against legitimate educational institutions. Unsubstantiated? Thornton turned to face him. There are documented reports from multiple sources about conditions in these schools. Deaths, abuse, systematic cultural destruction. But I'll withdraw the characterization. Caleb, you were being transported to a school. What happened? We escaped. The guards got careless one night and we ran. We traveled for weeks, hiding during the day, moving at night. It was getting cold, and the little ones were sick and starving. We knew we wouldn't survive winter on our own. So you took a chance on Mr. Granger? We watched his ranch for 3 days before making contact, saw that he was alone, that he seemed kind to his animals, that he left food out after he spotted us. When we finally approached him, when little Tessa said we were starving, he didn't hesitate. He fed us, sheltered us, kept us safe. And in the 8 months since then, Caleb's expression softened. He's been more of a father to us than anyone since my own father was taken. He doesn't try to make us white. He encourages us to remember our language, our songs, our traditions, but he also teaches us skills we need to survive in this world. He treats us like his actual children, not like problems to be managed. Thornton let that statement hang in the air for a moment. Then he said, Caleb, Agent Crenshaw is going to argue that you should be returned to federal custody. What would you say to that? I'd say that they can take our bodies, but they'll never have our cooperation. We're family now, all 13 of us, and we choose to stay together. Crenshaw stood for cross-examination, his expression hard. Mr. Redfeather, you admit that you're fugitives from federal custody. I admit we escaped from people who wanted to destroy who we are. That's not what I asked. Yes or no, are you fugitives? By your definition, yes. And Mr. Granger knowingly harbored you, knowing you were escaped wards? Caleb met his eyes without flinching. Mr. Granger saved our lives. If that's a crime, then your laws are wrong. Crenshaw's face flushed. You're not qualified to determine what laws are right or wrong. You're a minor with no legal standing. I'm a person with the right to say who I want to live with, Caleb shot back. Or doesn't that matter in your system? Judge Blackwell intervened. That's enough. Agent Crenshaw, continue your questioning or dismiss the witness. But Crenshaw had lost control of the narrative. He asked a few more questions, but Caleb's composure and clear testimony had already made an impact. When the boy finally stepped down, several people in the gallery were openly crying. Thornton called witness after witness. Kai testified about the healing work she'd been doing in the community, about how Elias had encouraged her traditional knowledge rather than suppressing it. Alina spoke about learning to read and write, about discovering she had a gift for numbers and planning. Little Tessa climbed into the witness chair and told the judge in her clear, earnest voice that Elias was her papa now, and she didn't want to leave him. Then Thornton brought up the neighbors. Jim Patterson testified about the first time he'd visited the ranch and seen how the children had been cared for, how they'd clearly found safety and stability. Martha described visiting with the girls, teaching them quilting, seeing them thrive. Thomas Weatherby spoke about watching Elias work with the older boys, teaching them ranching with patience and respect. By the time Thornton rested his case, the courtroom was emotionally charged. Even some of the federal marshals looked uncomfortable with the idea of forcibly removing these children from what was clearly a loving home. But Blackwell maintained his stern expression. "This has been very moving," he said, his tone suggesting it had been anything but. "However, emotion doesn't change the legal reality. Mr. Granger, please take the stand." Elias stood, his legs feeling unsteady, and walked to the witness chair. From there he could see all 12 children watching him with absolute trust, believing he could somehow make this right. The weight of that faith was crushing. Thornton started gently. "Mr. Granger, how old are you?" 34. "And you've owned your ranch for how long?" 8 years. My wife Sarah and I bought it together, built it from nothing into one of the most productive operations in the territory. "Your wife passed away? 3 years ago?" Even now, saying it hurt. "She and our son both died in childbirth." "I'm sorry for your loss. After her death, you lived alone?" "Yes, for 3 years I worked the ranch alone. I was surviving, but I wasn't living. The house felt like a tomb. Every day was just another day to get through." "And then these children arrived?" "Then these children arrived," Elias confirmed, his voice growing stronger. "And suddenly, the house was alive again. Suddenly, I had a reason to get up in the morning beyond just feeding cattle. Suddenly, I remembered what it felt like to care about something more than my own grief." "You knew they were likely the escaped wards Agent Crenshaw was searching for?" It was the critical question, the one that could send Elias to prison. Thornton had coached him to be honest. Lying under oath would only make things worse. "I suspected," Elias said. "The timing was right, the circumstances fit, but I also saw 12 starving children who needed help, and I made a choice to help them first and worry about the legal complications later." "Why did you create false guardianship documents?" "Because I knew that without legal protection, the children would be taken back to a system that had already failed them catastrophically. I didn't do it to break the law for its own sake. I did it to protect children who desperately needed protecting." Blackwell leaned forward. "So you admit to forging legal documents?" "I admit to doing whatever was necessary to keep 12 children safe, healthy, and alive. If that's a crime, then I'm guilty. But I'm not sorry." "Not sorry?" Blackwell's voice was sharp. "You undermined federal authority, obstructed an investigation, and deliberately deceived officers of the law. And you're not sorry?" Elias met the judge's eyes directly. "Your Honor, I'm sorry that we live in a country where the government thinks it has the right to destroy families based on race. I'm sorry that children have to run for their lives from people who claim to be helping them. I'm sorry that doing the right thing required breaking the law. But am I sorry for giving 12 terrified, starving children a home? No, sir. I'm not sorry for that, and I never will be. The courtroom erupted in applause. Blackwell hammered his gavel, demanding order, but it took several minutes for the room to quiet down. Crenshaw stood for cross-examination, his face tight with anger. Mr. Granger, you're an uneducated rancher with no training in child welfare, no understanding of Cherokee culture, and no legal right to these children. What makes you think you're better qualified to care for them than trained educators at a federal institution? I'm not trained, Elias agreed, but I love them. And I've learned that love and respect matter more than credentials when it comes to raising children. Love? Crenshaw's voice dripped with scorn. You've known these children for 8 months. That's not love, that's sentiment. With respect, Agent Crenshaw, you don't get to tell me what I feel for my children. I've spent every day with them for 8 months. I've taught them, protected them, worried about them, celebrated their successes, and comforted their fears. If that's not love, then I don't know what is. They're not your children. They're Cherokee wards of the federal government. They're human beings, Elias said, his voice rising. Not property, not wards, not problems to be solved. They're children who deserve to be loved and protected and given a chance at a real life. And if your system can't provide that, then your system is broken. Crenshaw tried several more questions, but Elias's testimony had clearly resonated with the packed gallery. When he finally stepped down, the community's support was palpable. Thornton stood for his closing argument. Your Honor, this case comes down to a simple question. What serves the best interests of these children? The government argues for the letter of the law, for proper procedure, for maintaining federal authority. But I argue for the welfare of 12 human beings who've found safety, stability, and love in what was supposed to be a temporary refuge. He gestured to the children, sitting together in their row. Look at them. They're healthy, educated, thriving. They have a community that supports them, a guardian who loves them, and a future that's bright with possibility. The government wants to take them from this and place them in institutions with documented histories of abuse, neglect, and cultural destruction. How does that serve anyone's best interests? Mr. Granger broke the law. I don't deny that. But he broke it for the most noble of reasons, to save lives. And every single person in this community understands that sometimes the right thing and the legal thing aren't the same. We're asking you to choose right over legal. We're asking you to choose children over bureaucracy. We're asking you to let this family stay together. Thornton sat down, and Crenshaw rose for the government's closing. He argued procedure, law, federal authority. He painted a picture of a dangerous precedent where anyone could ignore federal mandates if they disagreed with them. He made technically sound legal arguments that completely missed the human element of the case. When both sides had finished, Judge Blackwell sat back in his chair, his expression unreadable. This is one of the most unusual cases I've encountered in 20 years on the bench, he said finally. The legal facts are clear. Mr. Granger violated federal law. The emotional facts are equally clear. These children have found a home here. He paused, and Elias felt his heart stop. This was it, the moment that would determine everything. The question before me, Blackwell continued, is whether strict adherence to law serves justice in this particular case. And I find myself troubled by the implications either way. If I rule for the government, I'm tearing apart a family that's clearly functional and loving. If I rule for Mr. Granger, I'm endorsing vigilante guardianship and undermining federal authority. The silence in the courtroom was absolute. Every person present was holding their breath. Blackwell looked directly at the children, his stern expression softening almost imperceptibly. I've sat in this chair for 2 decades. I've seen children abused, neglected, destroyed by adults who should have protected them. And I've never seen children fight as hard to stay with their guardian as these 12 have fought today. He turned to Elias. Mr. Granger, you broke the law. You forged documents, harbored fugitives, and obstructed a federal investigation. Under normal circumstances, I would be imposing criminal penalties and removing the children from your custody immediately. Elias felt Tessa grab his hand, her small fingers squeezing tight. However, Blackwell continued, and there was something different in his voice now, something almost human. These are not normal circumstances. The law was designed to protect children, not to harm them. And removing these children from a stable, loving home to place them in institutions with questionable track records would harm them significantly. Hope flickered in Elias's chest, fragile and tentative. Therefore, Blackwell said, I'm making a ruling that will likely end my career as a federal judge, but which I believe serves actual justice rather than mere law. I'm granting temporary custody of these 12 children to Elias Granger for a period of 1 year, during which time he will pursue formal adoption proceedings through Montana territorial courts. The federal government's claim of custody is hereby dismissed. The courtroom exploded. People were on their feet, cheering, crying, embracing. The children rushed to Elias, and he gathered as many as he could into his arms, while others pressed close around him. Through the chaos, he saw Blackwell watching with something that might have been satisfaction before the judge stood and left the bench. Crenshaw was furious, arguing with the bailiff, but there was nothing he could do. The judge had ruled, and the community was there to enforce that ruling if necessary. In the midst of the celebration, Thornton appeared at Elias's side. We need to start the formal adoption process immediately, he said. Blackwell gave us a year, but we should have everything finalized as quickly as possible. And Elias? His expression was serious. Blackwell will face consequences for this ruling. He basically told the federal government to go to hell. We owe him for that. I'll write him a letter, Elias said. Thank him properly. Do that. But more importantly, don't waste what he gave you. Make this family work. Make it so obvious that this was the right decision that no one can ever question it again. Elias looked at the children surrounding him, at Caleb's proud smile, and Kai's tears of relief, and little Tessa's absolute joy. He thought about Sarah, about the family they dreamed of building, and realized she'd been right all along. They had built something beautiful, just not in the way they'd imagined. The days following the hearing were a blur of celebration and relief. The community rallied around the Granger family with an enthusiasm that bordered on fierce protectiveness. Jim and Martha Patterson organized a barn raising to add more sleeping space to the house. Thomas Weatherby donated lumber. Other neighbors contributed furniture, blankets, and supplies. It became clear that the entire community had adopted the Grangers as something special, a family that represented what the frontier could be at its best, a place where people took care of each other regardless of background or circumstance. Thornton worked tirelessly on the adoption papers, cutting through bureaucratic red tape with the determination of someone who'd seen justice nearly denied and refused to let it happen again. 3 months after the hearing, official adoption documents were filed with the Montana Territorial Court. Each child received a legal name that honored both their heritage and their new family: Caleb Redfeather Granger, Kai Riverwind Granger, Alina Morningstar Granger. Their Cherokee names preserved in the middle, their new family name claiming them as Elias's own. The day the adoption became final, Elias gathered all 12 children in the living room. He'd been planning this moment for weeks, wanting it to be meaningful. I have something for each of you, he said, producing a wooden box Sarah had used for keepsakes. Inside were 13 items, 12 small medallions he'd had commissioned from a silversmith in Helena, and one larger one for himself. Each medallion was engraved with the Granger family crest he'd designed, a mountain peak with 12 stars arranged around it in a circle, and the words "Family Forged, Not Born" underneath. He gave each child their medallion, speaking their full name as he did. When he reached Tessa, now 6 years old and not quite so small anymore, she threw her arms around his neck. "Does this mean you're really our papa forever?" she asked. "Forever and always," Elias confirmed, his voice rough with emotion. That night, they celebrated with a feast that included both traditional Cherokee dishes the children had taught him to make and the frontier staples he'd grown up with. The blending of cultures on that table symbolized what they'd built together, something new and unique that honored all their histories. As months turned into years, the Granger family became a fixture in the territory. The children grew and thrived in ways that amazed everyone who'd known them as starving refugees. Caleb developed into a skilled rancher and businessman, his natural intelligence finding full expression now that he had opportunities for education. By age 18, he was helping Elias manage not just their ranch, but consulting with other operations on horse breeding and cattle management. Kai's healing practice expanded until she was treating people from 3 counties over. her blend of traditional Cherokee medicine and frontier doctoring earning her a reputation that transcended racial boundaries. Eventually, a traveling physician named Dr. Marcus Webb took notice of her skills and offered to teach her formal medicine. The idea of a Cherokee woman becoming a trained doctor was revolutionary, but with Elias's support and the community's backing, Kai pursued it relentlessly. Alina discovered a gift for teaching and began running informal classes for younger children in the community, both Cherokee and white. Her patient nature and clear explanations made her beloved by students, and eventually the territorial government recognized her unofficial school as an official institution, one of the first in Montana to openly embrace cultural diversity in its curriculum. The younger children flourished too. Marcus became a voracious reader, eventually corresponding with scholars back east about history and philosophy. The twins, Thomas and Joshua, showed remarkable mechanical aptitude and began inventing improvements to ranch equipment that other settlers purchased and copied. Tessa, the little girl who'd first whispered, "We're starving, sir," grew into a fierce advocate for children's rights, writing letters to territorial representatives and newspapers about the treatment of tribal children. 5 years after the hearing, the Granger Ranch had become more than just a home. It had become a haven for other Cherokee families displaced by government policies. With Blackwell's precedent and the community's support, Elias and the children began quietly taking in other refugees, offering temporary shelter and help finding permanent situations. The ranch expanded to accommodate the need. Additional buildings went up. The community school that Alina ran became formalized, with children from miles around attending classes where Cherokee language and culture were taught, alongside reading, writing, and arithmetic. It became a model that other territories began studying and occasionally replicating. Elias himself changed dramatically over those years. The grief-stricken man who'd been merely surviving found himself not just living but thriving. He laughed more in one day now than he had in entire years after Sarah's death. The house that had been a tomb was now so full of life and noise and activity that sometimes he had to retreat to the barn just for a moment of quiet, but he loved every chaotic minute of it. On an autumn evening 6 years after the hearing, Elias stood on his porch watching the sunset paint the Montana sky in shades of gold and crimson. The children, his children, legally and emotionally and in every way that mattered, were scattered around the ranch finishing evening chores. He could hear Caleb working with the horses in the corral, Kai in the garden harvesting herbs, Alina inside preparing dinner with the younger girls, the boys arguing good-naturedly about whose turn it was to feed the chickens. The sound of hoofbeats drew his attention to the road. A lone rider was approaching, and something about the careful pace and formal bearing made Elias tense slightly. After 6 years of relative peace, unexpected visitors still triggered old instincts. But as the rider drew closer, Elias recognized him and relaxed. It was Judge Blackwell, looking older than he had at the hearing, his face weathered by years and difficult decisions. Blackwell dismounted slowly, and Elias noticed he moved with the stiffness of someone fighting pain. "Mr. Granger," the former judge greeted him, "I hope I'm not intruding." "Judge Blackwell, not at all. Please, come in. Coffee?" They settled on the porch with mugs of strong coffee, and for a few minutes they sat in companionable silence, watching the children move about their tasks. "They look well," Blackwell finally said. "They are well. Better than I ever hoped." Elias paused, then added, "I never properly thanked you for what you did, for choosing justice over law." Blackwell smiled faintly. "As you predicted in your letters, that choice cost me my position. I was removed from the federal bench 6 months after your hearing. Too many ruffled feathers in Washington, too much concern that I'd set a dangerous precedent. I'm sorry." "Don't be. It was the right decision, and I've never regretted it. I've spent the past 5 years practicing territorial law, defending people who couldn't otherwise afford representation. It's more satisfying than anything I did as a federal judge." Caleb emerged from the barn and spotted them, recognition dawning. He walked over, now 19 years old and every inch a man, and extended his hand to Blackwell. "Judge," he said simply, "I don't know if you remember me." "Caleb Redfeather Granger," Blackwell said, shaking his hand. "I remember every one of you. How could I forget?" One by one, the other children noticed the visitor and came to pay their respects. It became an impromptu gathering on the porch, with the older children sharing what they'd accomplished since the hearing and the younger ones hanging back shyly until Tessa, now 11 and absolutely fearless, walked right up to Blackwell. "You're the judge who let us stay with Papa," she said. "Mama Sarah would have liked you." Blackwell looked confused until Elias explained, "They call my late wife Mama Sarah. Even though they never met her, they figure she's watching over us, and I don't argue." "She probably is," Blackwell said, his eyes suspiciously bright. He looked around at the assembled family, at their healthy faces and confident postures, and the obvious love between them all. "This is what I hoped for when I made that ruling, but I'll admit, even I didn't dare dream it would turn out this well." That evening, Blackwell stayed for dinner, a massive, chaotic affair with everyone talking over each other and dishes being passed and stories being told. At one point, Marcus started a debate about territorial politics that had Blackwell laughing and engaging with arguments he clearly hadn't expected from a teenage Cherokee boy on a Montana ranch. After dinner, as children dispersed to various evening activities, Blackwell pulled Elias aside. "I came here today for a specific reason," he said. "There's a territorial convention coming up in 3 months. We're debating laws regarding custody, adoption, and the treatment of tribal families. I'd like you and some of your children to testify about your experience. Show them what's possible when we prioritize human welfare over bureaucratic control." Elias considered. Public speaking wasn't his strength, and he knew testifying could expose them to renewed scrutiny. But he also understood that they'd been given something precious, a chance to prove that families could transcend race and origin, and with that gift came responsibility to help others. "We'll be there," he said. 3 months later, Elias stood before the Montana Territorial Convention with Caleb, Kai, and Alina beside him. He told their story, not sparing the details about the forged documents and the desperation that had driven him to break the law, but also sharing the transformation that had followed. Caleb spoke about the difference between education that destroys and education that empowers. Kai discussed healing practices that honored traditional knowledge while incorporating modern medicine. Alina presented data from her school showing that children who learned about multiple cultures outperformed those in single-culture education. Their testimony was powerful enough that the territorial legislature passed new laws, creating pathways for cross-cultural adoption, establishing protections for tribal families, and reforming the custody system to prioritize children's welfare over institutional convenience. Other territories began studying Montana's model, and slowly, very slowly, change began to ripple outward. 10 years after 12 starving children had stumbled onto his ranch, Elias Granger sat at a table with what had become one of the largest and most unusual families in Montana. Some of the original 12 were starting families of their own now. Caleb had married a young woman from a neighboring ranch, and they had a baby daughter they'd named Sarah. Kai was in medical school back east, writing letters home every week. The younger ones were growing into remarkable young adults with dreams and plans and confidence he'd once feared they'd never have. But they still gathered for Sunday dinners, still came home to the ranch that had become their anchor. And they still called Elias Papa, still looked at him with the love and trust that had saved him from his own grief all those years ago. On this particular Sunday, with 3 generations now gathered around Sarah's old kitchen table, Tessa stood up with a glass of cider in her hand. "I want to make a toast," she announced, "to Papa Elias, who looked at 12 starving, terrified children and saw a family, who broke the law to keep us safe and spent every day since proving that blood doesn't make family, choice does, who built us a home when we had nothing and taught us that belonging isn't something you're born with, it's something you create together." She raised her glass and everyone followed suit. "To Papa, to family, to home, to family," they echoed. Elias looked around the table at faces that had become as dear to him as his own heartbeat, at the life they'd built together from broken pieces and desperate hope, and felt gratitude so profound it bordered on pain. Sarah had been right all along. They'd built something beautiful, a family forged in crisis and bound by love, a home that had become a haven, a legacy that would outlast them all. That night, after everyone had left and the house was finally quiet, Elias walked out to the small cemetery plot on the hill where Sarah and baby Thomas were buried. He knelt by the headstone, running his fingers over the carved letters. "I did it," he whispered. "We filled the house with children and laughter, just like we planned. They're not the children we thought we'd have, but Sarah, They're ours, and they're wonderful. I think you'd be proud." The wind whispered through the grass, and Elias chose to believe it was Sarah's way of saying she'd been there all along, guiding him toward the family they were meant to build. He stood slowly, joints creaking with age and hard work, and looked back at the ranch house with light glowing warm in the windows. His children, all 12 of them, plus the grandchildren starting to arrive, had made this place everything he and Sarah had dreamed it could be. A home, a refuge. A place where love mattered more than law and family was defined by choice rather than blood. As Elias walked back toward the house, he thought about Agent Crenshaw and Judge Blackwell and all the people whose decisions had shaped the course of his family's life. He thought about the courage it had taken for 12 children to trust a strange white man who offered them safety when they had every reason to believe no one could be trusted. And he thought about how sometimes the broken pieces of different lives can come together to create something stronger and more beautiful than anything that came before. The door opened before he reached it, and little Marcus, not so little anymore at 16, held it for him. "You okay, Papa?" the boy asked. "I'm perfect, son. Absolutely perfect." And walking into the warm house filled with the sound of his family, Elias meant every word. This was what they'd built from starvation and loneliness, from desperation and grief, from courage and hope. This was the legacy that would endure long after the people who'd tried to tear them apart were forgotten. A family that chose each other, a home that welcomed the broken, a love that transcended every barrier society tried to erect. And on a Montana ranch under endless sky, that family thrived, not despite their unusual beginning, but because of it. Because they'd learned early that the strongest bonds aren't inherited, they're forged.